The land of China was once veiled in mystery to the rest of the ancient world. The Silk Road served as a connection between the two realms, suggesting that China possessed immense wealth and influence. While these distant civilizations experienced dramatic declines, China continued to rise through countless dynasties and emperors for thousands of years, forming the global superpower we know today. From constructing the longest structure in the world to witnessing some of the largest and deadliest wars in human history, China's legacy is unparalleled. China is the longest continuous civilization on Earth, dating back nearly 5,000 years. It endured the Ancient Age, the Middle Ages, and now the modern era. But can it continue to thrive? To understand this fascinating land, we must begin at the start. Most of China's earliest settlements emerged along the basin of the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south. The people lived on fertile floodplains and followed agricultural lifestyles, cultivating large quantities of millet and rice. The conditions were suitable for farming, but a major problem troubled these growing communities. Flooding from the Yellow River frequently displaced or killed settlers, sweeping away their crops and homes in the process. The land was harsh and unforgiving, threatening their newly established way of life. That was when the legendary and likely mythical Yu the engineer was entrusted with controlling the flow of the rivers. Yu understood firsthand that the waterways had become the settlers' greatest enemy for a reason. His father, Gun, had already led previous efforts to tame the rivers, spending a decade constructing a series of dikes and dams that ultimately proved ineffective. No matter how massive Gun and his workers built their barriers, the river prevailed time and time again. Undeterred by his father's failures, Yu remained determined to complete the monumental task. He enlisted the help of Hou Yi, another semi-mythical agricultural genius credited with introducing millet to humanity. Together, the pair discussed plans and eventually constructed a canal-based irrigation network that redirected most of the excess floodwater into the sea while preserving some for irrigation and crop production. Just like that, the system's success finally ended the era of devastating floods, and Yu the engineer was declared China's ruler because of his achievement. Thus began the Xia dynasty, the foundation of China's dynastic system. The dynasty and its territories flourished under Yu's rule. Society remained largely agricultural, but the Xia are credited with creating several important Chinese inventions, such as stone farming tools and the lunar calendar. Eventually, Yu divided the territory into 9 provinces. Although each province was governed by its own lord, all were expected to remain loyal to Yu's authority. After many years spent controlling rivers and defeating neighboring tribes, old age and death approached Yu, raising an important question. What would happen next? Yu decided that he did not want to pass leadership to his son Qi. Instead, he wished for his Minister of Justice, Gao Yao, to succeed him. Unfortunately, Gao Yao died shortly afterward, and a tribal leader named Yi was selected to assume the role. The provincial lords opposed this decision. They had grown deeply attached to Yu the Great during his 45 years as emperor, and insisted that his son Qi should become his successor. Their wish was eventually granted. Qi became the first ruler of China to gain power not through merit or ability, but through bloodline and family connections. This hereditary system would endure for thousands of years. Because of the importance of philosophical development during this period, the era and its achievements are remembered as the 100 schools of thought. At the same time as these developments, various states within the Zhou dynasty began declaring their independence. Former dukes started calling themselves kings, and insisted that they were politically equal to the Zhou ruler. This era is known as the Warring States period, a time of conflict in which 7 former vassal states fought for ultimate control of China's lands. They were Qin, Han, Yan, Wei, Chu, and Qi. It was during this period that the famous general and strategist Sun Tzu wrote The Art of War, the earliest known work on military science and warfare. Although the book covered a broad range of tactics and wartime philosophies, such as when to advance an army and how to maintain strategic flexibility in the face of unpredictable conflict, it is no surprise that the art of war emerged in this age. Warfare had transformed in China. Battles became increasingly sophisticated during the Warring States era, with generals relying on strategy and deception to get conscription extending to males as young as 15. Individual battles often lasted far longer than the clashes of earlier times, sometimes stretching for months or even years. The most powerful rising force in the country during this age was Qin. They were led by Yingzheng, or Qin Shi Huang, which literally translates to First Emperor of Qin. They lived in a dangerous region of China, where a powerful military was essential for survival, and therefore adopted various weapons technologies, such as iron swords and crossbows. The first of the 7 kingdoms to fall to Qin was Han. They were the weakest of the states, and their territory lay in the center of ancient China, leaving them exposed to attacks from every direction. Although alliances and shared interests had protected them in the past, the Warring States period created an every-man-for-himself mentality. Yingzheng and his forces rapidly conquered the territory and forced King An of Han to surrender within a year. However, much stronger opponents awaited in the years ahead. Yingzheng's next target was the state of Zhao. It was not the first time the two powers had clashed. Only a few decades earlier, they had fought in the Battle of Changping, one of the deadliest battles in human history. Historical records estimate around 450,000 Zhao deaths and 250,000 casualties on the Qin side. Because of this crushing Qin victory, Zhao was still weakened when Yingzheng marched his troops across their borders to finish what had begun years earlier. Despite their declining state, Zhao possessed something Qin lacked: a general named Li Mu. Li Mu had earned an impressive military reputation through his clever tactics against massive enemy armies and his victories in countless raids and battles. When it became clear that Qin intended to conquer Zhao, his focus shifted to the western frontier to confront the newly risen Yingzheng. Any progress made by Qin troops was immediately countered by Li Mu's strategies, and it became obvious to Yingzheng that as long as Li Mu remained alive, little progress could be achieved. Unable to defeat him on the battlefield, Yingzheng turned to political schemes. He bribed officials in the Zhao court and sent spies to create chaos within the government. His goal was to create distrust between King Yumu of Zhao and General Li Mu. Eventually he succeeded, and the king became convinced that Li Mu and his trusted allies were planning a rebellion. The general was stripped of his command and executed. Zhao was swiftly conquered after Li Mu's death, as his replacement, Zhao Kong, proved no match for the ruthless Qin. The state's capital, Handan, fell in 228 BCE, and Yingzheng ensured that the naive king Yumu was executed as well. Although several self-proclaimed kings and kingdoms of Zhao emerged after this devastating defeat, the state was no longer a serious threat to Qin. Any rebellion or royal descendant who rose to power was crushed over the next few years until the entire region was completely annexed. After this victory, Yingzheng turned his attention to the kingdom of Yuan. Fully aware of the military threat approaching his borders, Crown Prince Dan sought to defeat Qin in another way, by assassinating Yingzheng himself. He selected an assassin named Jing Qi to carry out the mission using a poisoned dagger of exceptional quality. The plan was to approach the Qin court disguised as a traitorous nobleman seeking mercy. Jing Qi would present maps of Dukang, the fertile farmland that Yingzheng hoped to seize, along with the severed head of the defected Qin general Huan Yi. The dagger would be hidden inside the rolled maps, so that Jing Qi could strike as soon as he approached the king. Huan Yi, whose head was essential for the plan, had fallen out of favor with Qin and sought revenge for his disgrace, causing the Qin court to place a bounty of 1,000 gold pieces on him. After Jing Qi explained the plot, the disgraced general agreed to take his own life so that his head could be delivered to Yingzheng. As long as it meant the emperor would die and Qin would collapse, he slit his own throat without resistance. With both the maps and the head prepared, Jing Ke and his nervous companion, Qin Wuyang, travelled to present their gifts to Ying Zheng. Qin Wuyang became so anxious upon reaching the palace that he nearly froze in place and could barely move. Jing Ke excused his behaviour as simple awe and culture shock, explaining that Qin Wuyang was merely a rural boy who had never seen the wider world. Despite Jing Ke's explanation, Qin Wuyang was forbidden from entering any farther, forcing the assassin to continue alone. Jing Ke calmly approached King Zheng with the scroll and waited for it to be unrolled before drawing the dagger and lunging toward him. The king was startled by the sudden attack and slipped from Jing Ke's grasp, turning a palace, with the king narrowly surviving by running in circles around a pillar. The armed guards remained outside, and his ceremonial sword was too long to draw quickly enough to defend himself. All he could do was hope that someone intervened before the assassin reached him. Fortunately for Ying Zheng, a royal physician stepped forward and threw his medicine bag at Jing Ke, slowing him down just long enough for the king to unsheath his sword. Ying Zheng stabbed Jing Ke in the leg, prompting the wounded assassin to throw his dagger in a final attempt to kill his target. He missed, and was stabbed 8 more times by Ying Zheng. In his final moments, Jing Ke mocked the king with obscene gestures, until both he and the fleeing Qin Wuyang were executed by the guards. The assassination had failed disastrously and only created an even angrier and more determined Ying Zheng. He invaded Yan in 226 BCE and quickly captured the capital, Jicheng. Desperate to gain forgiveness, King Shi of Yan executed his own son, Crown Prince Dan, as punishment for the failed assassination attempt. He sent his son's head to Ying Zheng, temporarily delaying the complete conquest of Yan for a few years before Qin returned and destroyed the kingdom once and for all in 222 BCE. Xu Fu requested a group of archers for their next expedition so they could defeat the creature and continue their mission. Ying Zheng agreed and once again gave him everything he asked for. However, Xu Fu and his crew never returned from the voyage. What truly happened remains unknown today, although the most popular theory suggests that Xu Fu simply sailed to Japan and settled there. Growing increasingly paranoid and desperate, Ying Zheng began consuming potions created by his own alchemists. It was during this period that a series of now famous book burnings and live burials occurred, as Ying Zheng had descended into madness. Determined to erase all histories and ideologies that he believed weakened his reign and the Qin dynasty, Ying Zheng ordered 460 Confucian scholars to be buried alive and destroyed many of their writings in massive book burnings, the first recorded instances of book burning in human history. Soon afterward, in an ironic twist, Ying Zheng's search for eternal life led to his death at the age of 49. The mixtures supplied by his alchemists contained dangerous amounts of mercury, which poisoned and killed the emperor. Before his death, the emperor had ordered the construction of a magnificent mausoleum to house his remains. An underground city filled with artifacts, monuments, and thousands of clay warriors meant to accompany Ying Zheng into the afterlife was accidentally discovered by a group of farmers in 1974 AD. The scale and craftsmanship of each soldier astonished archaeologists. No 2 warriors possessed identical facial features, and, like a real army, they were organized according to military rank and battle formation. Subjected to countless cuts and slices across different parts of the body. The goal was not immediate death, but the prolonging of pain and suffering. To make matters worse, his entire family, extending to the 3rd generation, was also executed. Taking advantage of the weakened state, massive revolts erupted across the empire. Liu Bang, a peasant under the Qin dynasty, led a major uprising and seized control of the land after a fierce conflict known as the Battle of Gaixia, in which more than 100,000 men were killed or captured. Thus began the remarkably successful Han dynasty. With his victory, Liu Bang assumed the title of emperor, changed his name to Gaozu, and established the capital of the new Han state in Chang'an. It was one of the few surviving regions of the destroyed Qin Empire with an intact palace, making the choice relatively straightforward. Chang'an is where the Han's namesake originated, and the period during which it served as the capital is known as the Western Han, lasting from 206 BCE to 9 AD. Today, more than 90% of Chinese people identify as ethnically Han, accounting for nearly 20% of the world's population. The Han were the most populous state on earth and were contemporaries of the Roman Empire. After gaining power, Gaozu established Chinese policies that would endure for thousands of years. Having risen from peasant origins himself, he quickly replaced many laws and precedents that he considered unfair to common people. Taxes were significantly reduced, especially in regions devastated by war. Many slaves were also freed. Confucianism returned as the dominant philosophical school and was taught at the empire's new imperial academy. Family loyalty and virtue once again became the foundations of Chinese society, replacing fear and punishment. Gaozu also established the civil service system to prevent lazy and unqualified men from occupying important political offices. The ruling class was now based on merit and education rather than family connections. This governmental structure would survive until 1912 AD, nearly 2,000 years later. Although Gaozu and the Han state had secured power, the empire was far from safe. The same nomadic Xiongnu who had threatened the Qin still posed a serious danger, and the loyalty of many Han generals remained uncertain. Following a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of the Xiongnu, Gaozu negotiated peace and agreed to pay tribute. Wine and women were offered to the Xiongnu every year in exchange for stability. Gaozu died in 195 BCE, triggering a struggle for the throne. Although Hui, Gaozu's second son, became emperor, the true ruler of Han was Hui's mother, Empress Lu. She had murdered several of Gaozu's sons to secure her authority after his death. Her most notorious victim was Gaozu's favorite concubine, Lady Qi. Lady Qi also had children with Gaozu, and Empress Lu wanted no rivals. Sima Qian, a historian of the Han dynasty, wrote that Empress Lu cut off Lady Qi's hands and feet, gouged out her eyes, burned her ears, forced her to drink a potion that rendered her mute, and threw her into a privy, calling her human swine. Emperor Hui was so horrified and demoralized by his mother's brutality that he effectively surrendered ruling power to her. He spent the remainder of his short life indulging in drinking and pleasure before dying in 188 BCE at the age of 22. Several rulers gained and lost power over the following decades, maintaining a relatively stable period despite the ongoing conflict with the Xiongnu. In 141 BCE, Emperor Wu ascended to the throne and ruled for 57 years, until 87 BCE. By this time, tensions with the Xiongnu had reached a breaking point, and full-scale war erupted in 133 BCE. Several Han envoys were sent westward during the conflict to seek potential allies against the Xiongnu. Chinese silk trade had been disrupted by the tribes, and the Han sought alliances with Western peoples to oppose them. What these envoys brought back was knowledge of foreign civilizations, trade networks, and the economies of India, the Middle East, and the Western world. A trade route known as the Silk Road was established, stretching from China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The name Silk Road comes from the Greek word for China, Ceres, meaning the land of silk. China would depend on the Silk Road for commerce for more than 1,500 years. The Silk Road allowed unprecedented cultural exchange and eventually introduced Buddhism to China, although historians still debate whether Emperor Wu was aware of the religion during his reign. Han territory expanded greatly during this era of warfare as the empire won numerous major battles against the Xiongnu tribes. The dynasty extended southward into regions that are now modern-day Vietnam and Myanmar. Despite these victories, the Han treasury was drained by the enormous cost of war. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died, while peasants were heavily taxed to finance the conflict, bringing about another period of rebellion and instability. In the year 9 AD, a rising politician named Wang Mang exploited the weakened condition of Han and established the short-lived Qin dynasty. All of the empire's land was seized by Wang Mang and redistributed among the peasantry, earning him the historical nickname of China's socialist emperor. Policies such as these were unpopular among wealthy citizens. The empire was left in ruins after a series of natural disasters and a devastating famine, creating yet another age of unrest and rebellion. Like the Western Han before it, the Qin dynasty also failed to eliminate the Xiongnu threat along China's northern frontier, causing the treasury to be depleted once again. The people of Qin had finally had enough. Two major rebel groups rose to prominence during this period, the Red Eyebrows and the Lulin. The name Red Eyebrows originated from the rebels painting their eyebrows red to distinguish themselves from government supporters and the ruling class. Imperial armies were repeatedly defeated by the rebels, and Wang Mang was killed in battle in 23 AD. Although the Red Eyebrows continuously defied expectations and displayed remarkable strength, they eventually lost public support because of their disorganization and inability to restore order to China. They came to be viewed as little more than a violent mob because of their harsh treatment of local populations and the desecration of Han tombs. The Red Eyebrows remained trapped in constant chaos and suffered heavy losses toward the end of their rebellion. Eventually, they surrendered to Liu Xiu, one of 11 self-proclaimed emperors at the time, who had participated in the Lulin uprising against Wang Mang. Liu Xiu, later known as Emperor Guangwu, was a benevolent ruler who pardoned the Red Eyebrows before beginning his conquest of the. He defeated all the other rival emperors until he alone occupied the throne. The city of Chang'an had been destroyed during the rebellions, so Guangwu established the new Han capital at Luoyang. This era is known as the Eastern Han, the latter half of the long-lasting Han dynasty. Under Guangwu, taxes were reduced, and the emperor ensured that the quality of life improved for ordinary peasants. More than 100 academic institutions were established using government funds to guarantee a well-educated future ruling class. Guangwu continued to promote Confucianism and introduced a system in which local governors nominated young men who embodied Confucian virtues for government service. With such a strong foundation established by the dynasty's first emperor, the Eastern Han entered a golden age during the 1st and 2nd centuries. The economy flourished, educational policies were more advanced than ever before, and the military was incredibly strong. Crossbows allowed Han soldiers to strike enemies from a safe distance, while durable iron axes and swords greatly enhanced close-range combat. Resistance in Vietnam and Korea was crushed, and the Xiongnu tribes living within Han territory were defeated after they once again rebelled against the empire. The role of the emperor became far less respected during this period as the civil servant class emerged as the most influential group in Chinese society. Paper was also invented at this time, allowing ideas to spread much more easily than before. Emperors were installed and removed according to the wishes of civil officials, but many rulers were more concerned with luxury and pleasure than governing the empire. This lack of centralized leadership led to poor policies that increased taxes and contributed to another famine in China. As a result, another powerful rebellion rose from the ashes, the Yellow Turban Rebellion, led by the Taoist Zhang Jue, who claimed that the Han dynasty was already nearing its end. The rebels began attacking government offices and raiding villages in 184 AD. Although they ultimately failed to overthrow the Han, the empire was indeed approaching its final days. In order to defeat the Yellow Turbans, the bureaucracy was forced to hand significant amounts of power back to the nobility, who divided themselves into individual warlords, each controlling their own territory. Another age of warring states began, lasting until the final Han emperor was overthrown and only three major kingdoms remained: Wei, Wu, and Shu Han. Shu Han, the least populated of the three states, was the first to fall. They surrendered after exhausting their strength in wars against Wu. Despite gaining a massive amount of territory, Wei fell next. They were unexpectedly overthrown by a powerful clan known as Jin, who then defeated Wu, the last of the three kingdoms, in 280 AD. China was once again united, and a new dynasty had begun. Emperor Wu of Jin became the first ruler of the Jin dynasty and built a legacy defined by indulgence, extravagance, and sexual excess. He quickly became far more interested in feasting and spending time in his harem than fulfilling any of his political responsibilities. In 281, 5,000 women were brought from the palace of the conquered Wu emperor's son, Zhao, to Wu's own palace in Luoyang. With so many beautiful women now at his disposal, Emperor Wu struggled to decide whom he should spend the night with. His famous solution was to ride through the palace in a cart pulled by goats. Wherever the goats stopped, Wu would step out and sleep with whichever woman lived there. Some of the women even began placing bamboo leaves and salt outside their rooms, hoping to attract the animals. Wu was utterly consumed by lust, using this goat-drawn method almost every day for 8 years. He even went so far as to ban new marriages until he had finished selecting his concubines, ensuring that he could choose any woman he desired. When Emperor Wu died in 290, the Jin dynasty became entangled in a civil conflict known as the War of the Eight Princes. Numerous factions competed for power and began recruiting nomadic tribes such as the Xiongnu to assist them. The decision backfired when the nomadic peoples turned against the Jin dynasty and seized the northern regions of the empire. As a result, the Jin court moved its capital south to Jiankang. What followed was a period of constant changes in ruling families, both in the nomad-controlled north and in the Jin south. Both regions remained deeply unstable until the Sui dynasty emerged in 581 and reunified the empire in 589. Although the Sui dynasty was short-lived, it marked an important turning point in Chinese history. The Sui restored the rule of China's ethnic Han population and launched efforts to culturally assimilate the nomadic groups that had migrated into the empire. Confucianism and Buddhism flourished during this time, partly because Emperor Wen of Sui had been raised and educated by a Buddhist nun. It was, however, a difficult era to govern. North of the Sui, across the central steppes, the Turks were rising to power and becoming a formidable force, making expansion difficult. While the empire remained relatively stable for a brief period, it rapidly declined because of Emperor Yang Guang's constant misuse of resources. Yang Guang was obsessed with construction projects and warfare. Many peasants worked themselves to death rebuilding the Great Wall, while millions of soldiers perished during his attempts to conquer Goguryeo, modern-day Korea. The final invasion of Goguryeo was an absolute disaster, resulting in a casualty rate of nearly 90% for the Sui army, while Goguryeo suffered comparatively minor losses. This sparked even more rebellions, as the peasantry had grown exhausted and frustrated. During this age of resistance, a father and son pair became two of the most important figures in China. The father, Li Yuan, had been born in 566 during the era following the Three Kingdoms period. Li Yuan possessed numerous family connections to the throne, with many relatives closely tied to the emperor, although this did not necessarily make life easier for him. Emperor Yang Guang was cruel, tyrannical, and ruthless. offering little support to Li Yuan. His son, Li Shimin, was a bold military commander who successfully fought against the Turks on several occasions. He famously deceived his enemies by displaying an excessive number of flags and drums on the battlefield, tricking them into believing that the Sui army was much larger than it actually was. Although both Li Yuan and Li Shimin initially remained loyal to the Sui dynasty, it became increasingly clear that the empire was collapsing. Li Yuan was cautious and timid and did not wish to rebel, especially considering how many members of his family were connected to the throne. If Yang Guang discovered any sign of rebellion, Li Yuan's family, including his daughter Pingyang, would almost certainly be executed. Li Shimin, however, convinced his father to join the rebels, arguing that death was already approaching them regardless. Yang Guang had begun executing his own generals for failing to suppress the rebellions, and Li Yuan feared that he would be next. With little left to lose, it was now or never. Li Yuan spread rumors that the emperor was planning another invasion of Goguryeo that would require even more soldiers. Still furious about the previous campaigns, the peasants reached their breaking point. They did not want to die fighting for an inferior army in a war that offered them nothing in return. This allowed Li Yuan and Li Shimin to gather support for their rebellion and recruit more soldiers. After Li Yuan ensured the safety of his family by secretly encouraging them to flee the capital, the campaign to seize Chang'an began. Many doubted the future of the rebellion, as other rebel groups and the Turks in the north were also competing for power. Li Yuan remained fearful and uncertain. Li Shimin, however, once again persuaded his father to fight both the Turks and rival rebel forces. The army rapidly expanded and the Li family was reunited. Surprisingly, Pingyang had formed her own rebel force, numbering nearly 70,000 soldiers. The capital was captured in a major assault involving all of their forces, and Li Yuan seized power from Emperor Yang Guang's grandson. The emperor himself was hundreds of miles away in eastern China at the time, but he could not escape his fate. His own officials murdered him, and the Sui dynasty was unquestionably finished. Although Sui rule was brief, ending in 618, Li Yuan and Li Shimin had laid the foundations for a new golden age in Chinese history. The Tang dynasty is regarded as one of the greatest periods in Chinese history. The empire was stable, the population grew from 50 million to 80 million people, and scientific and cultural achievements flourished. The reign is viewed so favorably that even today, ethnic Chinese communities in Western cities, commonly called Chinatowns, are referred to as Tang Ren Ji, meaning Street of the Tang People. However, such prosperity did not come easily. Although Li Yuan and his family had defeated the Sui, many threats to his reign still remained. Two rival dynasties had emerged to the east, while the Turks continued to dominate the north. Taking advantage of the chaos that accompanied the rise and fall of dynasties, the Turks had gradually expanded into mainland China. Li Yuan declared himself the first emperor of the Tang dynasty, while Li Shimin was appointed prime minister. Li Yuan's eldest son, Li Jiancheng, who had also played an important role in the rebellion, was named crown prince and heir to the throne, despite lacking Li Shimin's military reputation. This left Li Jiancheng feeling insecure and overshadowed. An intense rivalry soon developed between the brothers. Li Jiancheng and another brother, Li Yuanji, began preparing a private army to overthrow and assassinate Li Shimin. Yuanji supported Li Jiancheng because he hoped to become crown prince himself once Jiancheng became emperor. Unfortunately for the two brothers, news of their plot spread quickly. Li Shimin was informed by his soldiers, and Li Jiancheng's scheme was exposed. He was placed under house arrest by his father, prompting one of his allies to openly rebel. Li Shimin was ordered to suppress the rebellion and was promised the title of Crown Prince upon his return to Chang'an. It took little effort for Li Shimin to defeat the rebel leader, who was killed by his own followers upon the arrival of the imperial army. Meanwhile, the weak-willed Li Yuan began softening his stance toward his son back in the capital. Li Jiancheng had grown close to his father's concubines, who often acted on his behalf and worked to improve his image. At Li Jiancheng's request, the women successfully persuaded the emperor to show mercy, likely emphasizing the importance of family unity. When Li Shimin returned, he was shocked to learn that Li Jiancheng would retain his position as crown prince. There was little time to dwell on his father's leniency, however, because the Turks had advanced to the outskirts of Chang'an. Li Shimin had negotiated a treaty involving regular payments to the Turks only 2 years earlier, in 622 AD, but the threat was becoming increasingly dangerous. Li Shimin approached the Khagan, leader of the Turks, outside the city and boldly declared that if the Turks were dissatisfied with their agreement, the two leaders should settle the matter in single combat. Unsure of what tricks Li Shimin had prepared, the Khagan withdrew to his camp. Li Shimin and his army remained nearby, and after a night of heavy rain, he sent a message describing the Tang army's favorable position and pointing out that the Turks' composite bows, made from wood and animal horns, would have weakened in the weather. Outmaneuvered by Li Shimin's strategy, the Khagan accepted the peace treaty once again and retreated without a single drop of blood being spilled. Upon Li Shimin's return, it became even clearer that he was destined to become the next great ruler of the Tang dynasty. This only made Li Jiancheng more desperate to eliminate his brother and secure power. Li Jiancheng hosted a banquet for Li Shimin and Li Yuanji, and secretly poisoned Li Shimin's wine. Li Shimin became gravely ill and had to be carried home, barely surviving after vomiting blood throughout the night. Unable to bear the rivalry between his sons, Li Yuan announced that he would divide the empire into 2 halves. Li Shimin was promised control of the eastern half, although he protested the decision. His stubborn father, however, had already made up his mind. The plan failed to end the rivalry. In the west, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji continued plotting Li Shimin's murder. In the east, Li Shimin's advisors repeatedly urged him to strike first and kill his brothers. Despite everything, he remained reluctant to attack his own family. When the Turks invaded once again in the summer of 626, the two scheming brothers saw the resulting chaos as the perfect opportunity to eliminate Li Shimin forever. Supported by Li Jiancheng, Li Yuanji asked his father for command of the army sent to confront the Turks. Although the emperor had originally intended to send the decorated Li Shimin, he reluctantly agreed. Much to Li Jiancheng's delight, Li Yuanji managed to win over many of Li Shimin's supporters while assembling his forces. Those who had once encouraged Li Shimin to act had given up trying to persuade him and were now focused on saving themselves. Confident in their success, Li Jiancheng promised Li Yuanji the title of crown prince once he became emperor. The brothers decided that, after killing Li Shimin, they would force their father to surrender the throne. Shortly afterward, however, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were summoned to their father's court. Li Shimin had sent a message accusing both brothers of secretly sleeping with several of the emperor's concubines. When the two discussed how to respond, Li Yuanji suggested pretending to be ill and refusing to appear. Li Jiancheng overruled him, insisting that they attend court and smooth over the situation. What followed became known as the Xuanwu Gate incident. As they approached Xuanwu Gate, the entrance to the palace city of Chang'an, both brothers began to sense that something was terribly wrong. They realized that they were walking into a coup d'état and immediately attempted to retreat, but by then it was far too late. Li Shimin charged through the gates on horseback and called out to them, prompting Li Yuanji to draw his bow. However, he was far too slow compared to the quick-thinking Li Shimin. Li Shimin swiftly drew his own weapon and fired an arrow directly into Li Jiancheng, killing him instantly. A chase followed, with Li Yuanji desperately trying to escape before Li Shimin could kill him as well. In the chaos, however, Li Shimin's horse became frightened and threw the middle brother to the ground. Li Yuanji seized the opportunity and attempted to strangle the fallen Li Shimin with his own bowstring. At the last possible moment, Yuqi Jingde, one of Li Shimin's allies, arrived and shouted at Li Yuanji. Li Yuanji tried to escape on foot, but he was quickly struck down by Yuqi's arrows. Overwhelmed by the situation, Li Yuan agreed that power should be transferred to his surviving son, Li Shimin, and ordered the opposing forces to submit to his authority. The male heirs of both Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were immediately executed to prevent any further instability. The two ambitious brothers had started a struggle that they could not finish, and it ultimately cost their family their lives. Li Yuan retired to a largely ceremonial position, while Li Shimin was proclaimed emperor. There was little time to celebrate his new role, however. The Turks had not halted their advance simply to allow the House of Li to settle its family disputes. They had already reached the outskirts of Chang'an. Li Shimin once again chose a peaceful solution, believing that the Khagan's selfish and cruel treatment of his followers would eventually tear the Turkic Khaganate apart and create a better opportunity for attack in the future. The Tang dynasty was too vulnerable to confront them directly, so Li Shimin renegotiated the peace treaty and agreed to continue paying tribute for the time being. Meanwhile, the new emperor concentrated on building trust and encouraging open discussion within his court. He selected ministers based on intelligence and talent, and even allowed advisors who had once served his treacherous brothers to join his government if he believed it would benefit the empire. Li Shimin encouraged his officials to speak honestly and criticize his decisions, and together they worked to improve domestic conditions before launching any campaign against the Turks. China entered an era of great prosperity under Li Shimin, now known as Emperor Taizong of Tang. Today he is widely regarded as the greatest of the hundreds of emperors who ruled throughout Chinese history, and it could be argued that China was the wealthiest and most powerful state in the world during this second golden age. But why exactly was that the case? Relations between the Turks and the Tang remained stable while Emperor Taizong focused on improving the lives of his subjects, but an opportunity to exploit the internal conflicts of the Khaganate emerged sooner than he had expected. Political unrest had been caused by the Khagan's mistreatment of the tribes under his control, and several of them broke away from his rule, causing the ruler to persecute them with all his strength. War erupted among the various tribes, and in 628, a lesser Khagan named Ashina Shibobi requested Emperor Taizong's assistance in defeating the selfish ruler. Taizong agreed, and together they defeated the leader of the Eastern Khaganate by the year 630. The tribes that had opposed the Khagan nominated Emperor Taizong to rule over them, making him the first emperor to hold the titles of both Chinese Emperor and Khan of Heaven. Even after Taizong's death in 649, the Tang dynasty continued to expand and became increasingly cosmopolitan. In cities such as Chang'an, the capital, which was the most populous city in the world at the time, nearly 2 million people lived. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all flourished under Tang rule. Monasteries and temples appeared throughout the great cities, while famous paintings, poetry, and pottery were produced as art, became an even greater pillar of Chinese culture. Military campaigns resumed in Korea and Vietnam, and the empire also conquered territories in the West, strengthening its ties with the civilizations of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. The Tang rapidly expanded and became the most powerful state in Southeast Asia. This success came largely because of the emphasis on strengthening domestic stability rather than exhausting all of the empire's resources. When an empire is secure within its borders, expansion beyond them becomes far easier. The Golden Age reached its peak during the early years of Emperor Xuanzong's reign, which began in 712, although the latter half of his rule marked the beginning of Tang decline. In 736, the historian, musician and politician Li Linfu became chief minister and steadily increased his influence as Emperor Xuanzong grew less interested, had many of his rivals executed, and introduced a number of policies that proved extremely damaging to the empire. Under this system was a Turk named An Lushan, who commanded an army of more than 150,000 soldiers in the northeast. He was highly favored by both the emperor and Li Linfu, and rose through the ranks rapidly, eventually even being granted the title of prince. However, after Li Linfu's death in 753, An Lushan found himself increasingly sidelined by political rivals. Realizing that he had little left to lose, he launched a rebellion against the dynasty in an attempt to seize power. What followed became known as the An Lushan Rebellion, one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. In 755, An Lushan captured the eastern capital of Luoyang and proclaimed himself emperor of the new Yuan dynasty. After this victory, he turned his attention toward the Tang capital of Chang'an. Despite his early successes and rapidly growing forces, An Lushan's next major campaign, the Siege of Yongqiu, ended in a decisive Tang victory. Yongqiu held enormous strategic importance and was a vital step in An Lushan's advance into southern China. Recognizing this, the Tang dispatched 2,000 soldiers to defend the city, killing 20,000 Yan troops in the process. The Yan forces could no longer advance because of the Tang defensive positions at Tong Pass, but the tide soon shifted because of political turmoil within the Tang court and disastrous military decisions. The Tang army was ordered to engage An Lushan's forces in open battle, where they suffered a crushing defeat. The road to Chang'an now lay open. Upon hearing of the approaching threat, Emperor Xuanzong fled the capital in an attempt to regroup in Sichuan province. However, the escape proved far more difficult than expected. The emperor had brought much of his household, court officials, and bodyguards with him, and chaos soon erupted. Hunger, exhaustion, and fear spread through the convoy as they crossed China's mountainous terrain, leading to the executions of several members of the imperial entourage. Fearing a mutiny, the emperor was forced to obey the demands of his soldiers, even when they called for the deaths of his own relatives. While Xuanzong watched helplessly as members of his family were strangled in the mountains, another kind of chaos consumed Chang'an. Thousands fled at the sight of the rebels, who stormed through the city and looted everything in their path. Hundreds of thousands died during the bloody capture of the capital. In August, Emperor Xuanzong finally reached Sichuan, where he abdicated in favor of his son. The new emperor hired mercenaries to oppose An Lushan and successfully prevented him from advancing farther south. However, the internal instability of the self-proclaimed Yan dynasty aided the Tang more than anything else. Fearing An Lushan's increasingly violent paranoia, his own son, An Qingshu, assassinated him on January 29, 757. The ruler had become progressively more brutal, beating his subjects whenever he pleased, and his declining health caused many of his followers to turn against him. It is even said that a horse was once crushed beneath An Lushan's enormous weight. Following his death, An Qingshu became ruler of Yan and launched a prolonged siege against the city of Suiyang, resulting in one of the most horrifying battles in Chinese history. It could be argued that both sides lost. Within the besieged city, widespread cannibalism broke out as residents resorted to eating elderly women and children after exhausting all food supplies. By the end of the siege, only 400 Tang defenders remained alive, less than 1% of the city's original population. Although the Yuan eventually captured Suiyang after nearly 8 months of fighting, they had suffered more than 100,000 casualties and wasted enormous amounts of time and resources. The Tang took advantage of this chaos to reclaim both Chang'an and Luoyang, while the Yuan dynasty began collapsing because of internal conflict. The rebellion was finally crushed in 763 and the Tang emerged victorious. However, the imperial government was far weaker than before, and the golden age of the Tang had unquestionably ended. Around 20% of the empire's population had died as a result of the An-Lushan rebellion, and the dynasty never fully recovered. Throughout the 9th century, the struggling Tang lost much of its northern and western territory to the Turks and the Tibetan Empire, both of whom exploited the dynasty's weakened condition. The Tang was ruled by a succession of ineffective emperors during this era. Large groups of bandits became increasingly common, raiding cities and smuggling illegal goods across the empire until full-scale rebellions erupted once again. In 875, a dissatisfied former salt smuggler named Huang Chao launched a peasant uprising with tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians. His forces steadily advanced into southern China, massacring thousands of people, particularly merchants whom they viewed as supporters of Tang rule. By 881, Chang'an had fallen, and Huang Chao proclaimed himself emperor of the Daqi dynasty. Angered by the selfishness and incompetence of China's wealthy elite, many of his reforms focused on confiscating their riches. However, it quickly became clear that Huang Chao was no better at governing an empire. Unfortunately for his self-proclaimed dynasty, he was unable to organize a stable food supply for the conquered capital. The Tang launched a series of counterattacks under the command of General Zhu Wen. Ironically, Zhu Wen had originally served as a general in Huang Chao's rebellion before defecting to the Tang in 882. With Zhu Wen's leadership, the government allied with several Turkic tribes and drove Huang Chao and his followers out of the capital. Huang Chao was killed in 884, and his legacy remains controversial. Some view him as a violent rebel responsible for terrible atrocities, while others regard him as a champion of the peasantry who sought to rid China of corruption and wealth hoarding. Whatever Huang Chao's true character may have been, the damage he inflicted upon the already weakened Tang Empire was irreversible. The central government had lost much of its authority and no longer possessed a unified army. As a side note, although the 9th century proved disastrous for the Tang dynasty, an invention that would forever shape world history was created within its borders around 850 AD, gunpowder. An unknown monk and alchemist was attempting to create a substance that could heal diseases and extend human life. In the process, he combined 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur. The result was scorched skin for the monks present, while the house in which they lived burned to the ground. Gunpowder was regarded as one of the 4 great inventions of China, alongside papermaking, printing, and the compass. Although the invention would be used far more effectively in the centuries to come, especially with the rise of the Song dynasty in the 10th century, history shows that it was Chinese monks under the Tang who first discovered the substance, regardless of what later dynasties or Western empires may claim. Without any widespread military application, however, the new substance did little to change the fate of the declining Tang dynasty. An era known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period was approaching, and would be defined by countless warlords and regimes competing for power across China. The period is notoriously difficult to follow because of how chaotic and unstable the region became. With constant assassinations, shifting alliances, and factions repeatedly breaking apart, the political landscape changed almost as rapidly as it had during the Warring States period. The name 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms emerged because 5 regimes successfully ruled over northern China, while 10 independent states established themselves in southern and western China. Although these kingdoms remained relatively stable during their existence, they were not nearly as influential as the 5 dominant dynasties. The first ruler among these 5 dynasties was the warlord Yuan. Although he had previously aided both the Huangqiao Rebellion and the Tang government, Yuan was now determined to serve his own interests. In 904, he executed the Tang emperor and installed the dead ruler's 13-year-old son as a puppet emperor. Only 3 years later, in 907, he usurped the throne and proclaimed himself Emperor of Liang, the first of the 5 dynasties that ruled during this age. However, many other warlords refused to accept his authority and established kingdoms of their own. One of these men was Li Keong, a longtime rival of Yuan. Before the Liang dynasty was founded, Yuan had attempted to assassinate Li Keong, so he naturally had no desire to serve the new emperor. Li Keong established the smaller kingdom of Jin, which would later play a major role in China's struggles for power. But rivals like Li Keong were not the only people who despised Emperor Yuan. Yuan frequently summoned his sons' wives to the palace in order to sleep with them. He was a notorious sexual predator who repeatedly assaulted both the wives of his officers and his own daughters-in-law. As a result of his terrible behavior, as well as disputes over which son would inherit the throne, the unstable ruler was murdered in his palace by his third son, Zhu Yugui. Zhu Yugui lasted only a single year before he, too, was killed by his younger brother, Zhu Yuzhen, in a coup for power. Zhu Yuzhen ruled from 913 onward, and his reign lasted roughly a decade. It was during this period that tensions between Liang and the Kingdom of Jin finally reached a breaking point. After numerous battles with Emperor Zhu Yuzhen's forces over disputed territories, the Kingdom of Jin had become powerful enough to challenge Liang directly in 923. They established what became known as the later Tang dynasty. They kept the name Tang because they wished to restore the former empire. Li Kengshu, the son of Li Keong, became the first emperor of the later Tang. Although the dynasty showed moments of brilliance and seemed capable of reunifying China, it failed to maintain control over its conquered territories because of repeated declarations of independence. The state descended into chaos because of Li Kengshu's poor leadership, as he and his consort, Empress Liu, hoarded wealth and neglected to reward soldiers for their sacrifices. In the spring of 926, Li Kengshu was finally killed during a mutiny. The next dynasty was founded by a veteran general named Shi Jingtang. His seizure of the throne marked the beginning of the third of the 5 dynasties, known as the later Jin, or Shijin. At the time, Shi Jingtang's army was not powerful enough to dominate China's rapidly shifting political landscape, and in 936 he sought assistance from the Khitan in the north. The Khitan were a nomadic people who controlled much of northeastern Asia, including modern-day Mongolia, as well as parts of China and Russia's Far East. One condition of the alliance was the transfer of the 16 prefectures of Yanyun, a region along the Great Wall that included the strategically important locations of modern Beijing and Tianjin. The Khitan Emperor, Yelu de Guang, was also granted superiority over Shi Jingtang. This eventually became the source of conflict. The later Jin no longer wished to live under the authority of the Khitan Emperor and attempted to distance themselves from Yelu de Guang's rule, enraging the man who had only recently helped establish their dynasty. War broke out, and the Khitan conquered the later Jin. They sacked Shang Prefecture, modern-day Anyang, and massacred much of the population. The Khitan state was renamed the Liao dynasty, and Yelu de Guang declared himself Emperor of all China. However, his reign did not last long. He was deeply unpopular among the Chinese people, and after facing constant resistance, he died while attempting to return north. Shortly afterward, the rebel Liu Yuan seized power and proclaimed himself emperor of the later Han dynasty. However, he died after ruling for only a single year. He was succeeded by his son, Liu Chengyu, who ascended the throne at just 17 years of age. A minister named Guo Wei soon overthrew the inexperienced ruler after only 3 years. As a result, the later Han became the shortest dynasty of the era, surviving for only about 5 years. In 951, Guo Wei declared himself emperor of the final one of the 5 dynasties, the later Zhou. The state existed as a vassal of the Khitan in the north and endured until 960, when a new force emerged to reunify China, the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty was founded after Zhao Guangyin, a military inspector and general of the later Zhou dynasty, seized control of the empire through a coup. He conquered the remaining regions that were still outside his authority and brought the chaotic 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period to an end. The history of the Song dynasty is divided into 2 major periods: the Northern Song, which lasted from 960 to 1127 AD, and the Southern Song, which lasted from 1127 to 1279. Zhao Guangyin, now known as Emperor Taizu of Song, spearheaded a project to map the entire empire and placed greater emphasis on scholarship. The civil service examinations were reformed, and Confucianism experienced a major revival. This renewed movement is commonly referred to as Neo-Confucianism in the context of the Song dynasty. Although the Song had reunified China, they were militarily weaker than the Tang dynasty that came before them. After Taizu's death, his successors faced constant threats from the Khitan Liao kingdom in the north, which had emerged during the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms era. Over time, the quality of the bureaucracy steadily deteriorated until the Yuan, a northern ethnic group from former Khitan lands that had overthrown the Liao, finally seized the opportunity. In 1126, the Yuan, now calling themselves the Jin dynasty, captured the capital city of Kaifeng. It was a tragic end for the northern Song, as the capital had become a magnificent cosmopolitan center before the invasion. The final northern Song emperor had been an enthusiastic patron of the arts, and as a result, the city was filled with beautiful temples, palaces, and pagodas, the tower-like structures commonly associated with Buddhism throughout East Asia. The city proved to be an easy target for the Jin. By the middle of the 12th century, the Song had become militarily weak, and the invaders burned much of the metropolis upon their arrival. The north had fallen under Jin control, but the conquerors failed to seize the southern territories of the Song dynasty. The southern Song period began in 1127, with Linnan, modern-day Hangzhou, serving as the capital. Despite losing the north to the Jin, the southern Song era was remarkably prosperous. Rice production expanded dramatically as farmers were granted ownership rights to their land, strengthening the economy as peasants could sell and trade their surplus goods. The population exploded, and many important inventions emerged. The printing press allowed for the mass production of paper currency, making the Song the first government in world history to achieve such a feat. The magnetic compass was also developed during this period, revolutionizing navigation. The Song dynasty also found new military uses for gunpowder, launching explosive bombs from catapults in warfare. These weapons allowed southern Song forces to defeat Jin armies and naval fleets, even when heavily outnumbered. Unfortunately, they were still unable to reclaim northern China. Their enemies were growing stronger and had begun copying Song technology by kidnapping craftsmen and forcing them to reproduce their weapons and tools. Recognizing their military disadvantage, southern Song scholars rejected many foreign influences and emphasized the preservation of traditional Chinese culture, fearing that their civilization might disappear entirely. This concern was one of the reasons Confucianism experienced a revival during the dynasty, as its principles were seen as essential to China's future. Greater emphasis was placed on healthy families and strong communities, contributing to the development of highly advanced cities. A golden age of painting and art flourished, with many works celebrating the beauty of village life and family harmony. No philosophy or artistic achievement, however, could save the song from its fate at the hands of one of history's most famous conquerors, Genghis Khan. Dramatic music. Genghis, originally named Temujin, was born in Mongolia in 1162 AD as a member of the Borjigin tribe and a descendant of an earlier leader. Legend says that Genghis entered the world clutching a blood clot in his fist, a sign in Mongol folklore that he was destined to rule. Life in his homeland was harsh, marked by constant tribal warfare and unforgiving landscapes, earning the region the title of the barbarian wilderness in China. Genghis spent his youth learning to hunt, travel, and ride horses, and was said to be quiet and uninterested in conversation. At the age of 9, his parents arranged his marriage to a girl named Berta from a neighboring tribe who was 10 years old at the time. Such arrangements were common among the Mongols, whose camps often included junior wives, concubines, and many children. Women had little influence over these decisions. Genghis was meant to move to Berta's camp after the engagement, so that the pair could grow up together. However, during the journey, rival Tatars poisoned and killed Genghis's father after offering food and drink, leaving the boy's family without a patriarch. Genghis returned home, only to find that his family had been abandoned by their tribe and left in a vulnerable position. Without a father figure, tensions grew between Genghis and one of his stepbrothers, Beta, as both claimed to be their father's rightful heir. Beta was the elder of the two, although Genghis was the son of the chief wife. Their rivalry reached its climax when Genghis was 13, and Beta attempted to take a fish that Genghis had caught. Genghis drew his bow and killed Beta, marking the first killing committed by a man who would eventually be associated with the deaths of roughly 40 million people. By the age of 15, Genghis had become highly skilled in hunting and horsemanship. He assumed leadership over his remaining brothers, prompting the clan that had once abandoned his family to capture him out of fear that he would seek revenge. He escaped during a feast and hid inside the tent of a guard who had failed to sound the alarm. Genghis remained there for 3 days, threatening to reveal the guard's role in his escape. In a clever move, he used this leverage to obtain a horse from the guard and disappeared into the night. At 16, Genghis returned to Berta's encampment to finally marry her after their earlier arrangement had been disrupted by his father's death. Berta's father welcomed him warmly and gifted Genghis a sable cloak. Genghis then presented the cloak to Togrul, the ruler of a neighboring tribe, in exchange for his alliance. Determined to regain the loyalty of the tribes that had abandoned his family, Genghis focused on building a strong following. He succeeded. Other clans began forming alliances with him, and before long he had assembled a considerable military force. Around this time, Genghis and Berta welcomed their first child, a daughter named Kojin. Soon afterward, however, disaster struck. A force of 300 Merkit horsemen raided Genghis's camp and kidnapped Berta. The Merkits were one of the 5 major tribal confederations of the region. Genghis swore revenge and assembled an army of thousands with the help of his allies. They launched a merciless assault and crushed the Merkits in a whirlwind of destruction and pillaging. Genghis found his wife, now pregnant, after suffering abuse in captivity, and brought her home. She later gave birth to their son Yoshi, whose true parentage would remain the subject of rumors for the rest of his life. Genghis and Berta would eventually have 3 more sons and 4 daughters over the following decade. During this time, Genghis grew increasingly close to his childhood friend and blood brother Jamukha and united their clans. The 2 men spent enormous amounts of time together, whether hunting, riding, or simply sharing daily life. According to legend, They even slept beneath the same blanket. Eventually, tensions emerged, and the two leaders parted ways. The reasons remain unclear, although some accounts suggest that Berta fueled the rivalry by spreading rumors about Jamuka. Unfortunately for Jamuka, many of his warriors abandoned him and joined Genghis. Before long, Genghis commanded the largest and most powerful Mongol clan and was proclaimed Khan of the Mongols. Just like his insatiable predecessors, the new great ruler turned his attention toward further expansion. Vietnam had slipped from Chinese control during the decline of the Tang dynasty, and the Yuan hoped to reclaim it. They also sought to conquer islands belonging to modern-day Indonesia, as well as Japan and territories farther east. They were largely unsuccessful, however, with many campaigns ending in disastrous defeats. In the end, they failed to establish control over any of those regions. It became clear that the Mongols needed a stronger governmental foundation, and so Kublai Khan created a caste-based society divided into 4 tiers. Each ethnic group was ranked according to the order in which it had been conquered. The Mongols naturally occupied the highest position, while other Central Asian peoples filled the second tier. Most of the empire's population belonged to the bottom 2 classes, with northern Chinese ranked third and the recently conquered southern Chinese placed at the very bottom. Each social class was granted different rights, with the overwhelming majority of political power concentrated at the top of the hierarchy in Mongol hands. Punishments for crimes varied in severity depending on one's ethnic status, and ethnic Chinese citizens were forbidden from owning weapons, dogs or eagles, in case they attempted to revolt against the empire. Despite these high levels of ethnic discrimination, the empire entered an age of prosperity. Trade flourished as the Silk Road was stabilized and used more heavily than ever before. Cities expanded, and Buddhist leaders gained influence because Kublai Khan favored the religion. Kublai Khan also restored the Grand Canal, a network of waterways stretching more than 2,000 kilometers and linking 5 of China's most important river basins, including the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. The famed Venetian merchant Marco Polo lived in China for 17 years during this period and later wrote about the remarkable inventions and customs of Yuan China upon his return to Europe. What fascinated him most was the use of paper money, the burning of coal as fuel, silk production, and the unusual sexual customs practiced under Mongol rule. Like all great dynasties and golden ages before it, however, the Mongol Empire did not last forever. Low tax revenues, corruption, weak leadership, and failed military campaigns all contributed to the decline of the Yuan dynasty after Kublai Khan's death. In 12 stating factors, however, was the plague epidemic of the 1330s. There remains much mystery surrounding the precise origins of the bubonic plague that would later devastate Europe and kill nearly a third of its population, but historians do know that it spread among Mongol soldiers in Crimea. China became the first nation to suffer from the Black Death after infected soldiers carried it across the empire, where it spread rapidly between 1331 and 1334. Roughly 13 million people died, and the disease spread to the rest of the known world through the Silk Road trade routes. When a second wave struck China during the 1350s, the death toll rose even further, although the exact number remains unknown. It was during this time that a peasant movement known as the Red Turbans began gaining momentum in northern China. Fueled by epidemics, natural disasters, and widespread famine, the civilian-led resistance opposed Mongol rule. Under the leadership of the former Buddhist monk Zhu Yuanzhang, the Red Turbans proved highly effective in battle and successfully overthrew the Mongol Empire by 1368. Although the Yuan had ruled China for less than a century, their legacy was enormously influential. China became far more connected to the Western world, trade expanded, and the empire was unified once again while gaining vast new territories. Even today, Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan remain among the most prominent figures in Chinese history, despite their non-Chinese origins. After the final Yuan emperor fled in 1368 AD, rebel leader Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed himself emperor of the Ming dynasty, which would endure until 1644. The Ming would become one of the most powerful empires in the world as Zhu Yuanzhang, better known as the Hongwu Emperor, consolidated his authority and assembled a standing army of more than 1 million men, far larger than those of any contemporary European state. Upon ascending to power, the new emperor declared Nanjing the capital and placed a heavy emphasis on reviving traditional Han culture. Neo-Confucianism once again became the dominant philosophy, and the arts flourished during this new age of prosperity for ethnic Chinese society. One of the most famous novels in history, Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which focused on the turbulent final years of the Han dynasty, was written during this period. The Confucian civil service examinations were restored to ensure that officials earned their positions through merit and learning, while Mongol names and clothing were banned throughout the empire. Public works projects also thrived during this era. Having suffered through famine and natural disasters as a peasant himself, the Hongwu Emperor established vast irrigation systems and dikes in an effort to improve agricultural production and the lives of farmers. As a result, the economy boomed, trade routes were restored and expanded, and the population grew rapidly. Under Hongwu's command that 10% of military personnel should serve as gunners, the Ming dynasty fully embraced gunpowder and developed early firearms and cannon batteries. These advancements allowed the empire to repel invading forces, such as the Mongol tribes in the north, and maintain its position as one of the world's great powers. It was truly an age of innovation and transformation under the emperor's rule. There was, however, a darker side to the Hongwu emperor. He was deeply paranoid about losing his grip on power and established a harsh legal code that introduced numerous brutal methods of execution into Chinese law. These punishments included lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, in which pieces of the body were gradually removed with a knife, as well as flaying, where the skin was stripped away in a prolonged and torturous process. Mass executions were carried out against anyone who opposed the emperor to ensure that no rebellions or coups could emerge. Fearing threats not only from within the empire, but also from the Mongols in the north, Hongwu desired stronger borders to protect China. This belief would be passed down for generations. Under the Ming, particularly during the reign of the Hongji Emperor, who ruled from 1487 to 1505, enormous resources were devoted to building and maintaining the Great Wall. The sections constructed under the Ming make up the most recognizable portions of the Great Wall that survive today. The desire for secure borders was not the only trait inherited from the dynasty's founder. Generations of Ming rulers were similarly power-hungry and ruthless. The dynasty's final emperor, Chongzhen, ascended the throne at just 16 years old after his illiterate and possibly disabled brother, the Tianqi emperor, died in 1627. By the time Chongzhen took power, the army had fallen into disarray. The economy was collapsing under the weight of corruption, greed, and rulers who focused more on preserving their authority than strengthening the nation. Enemies surrounded the empire, while a series of uprisings, known as the late Ming peasant rebellions, sought to overthrow the dynasty. The Ming dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. This crisis reached its climax in 1644, when the warlord Li Zicheng marched on Beijing with his army, prompting the emperor to hang himself. Li Zicheng immediately declared himself emperor, claiming that heaven had granted him the right to rule. He was not the only contender seeking to inherit the crumbling Ming Empire. The Manchus of northeastern Asia, who had steadily expanded their power throughout the Ming period and repeatedly attacked the empire, quickly seized the throne and established the Qing dynasty. This became China's second non-native dynasty, preceded only by the Mongol Yuan. Under the Shunji emperor, all Chinese men were forced to adopt the Manchu queue hairstyle, in which the hair at the top of the scalp was grown long and braided while the rest of the head was shaved. Wearing one's hair differently was considered an act of rebellion, and the style would become one of the defining symbols of Qing rule. The government also ensured that more than half of all high-ranking officials were Manchu in order to preserve their dominance within the empire. After the Shunji emperor died of smallpox in 1661, the 61-year reign of the Kangxi emperor began, the longest reign of any ruler in Chinese history. Despite his preference for Neo-Confucianism, Kangxi embraced multiculturalism and tolerated a wide variety of religious traditions. He even allowed Jesuit missionaries to spread their beliefs throughout the empire, encouraging the growth of Roman Catholicism in China. The greatest achievements of his reign, however, were his massive public works projects. The Grand Canal was repaired to simplify the transportation of food, while enormous dredging operations protected farmers from the flooding of the Yangtze River. Until his death in 1722, Kangxi worked tirelessly to remain informed about the affairs of the empire and to plan future projects. Because of this dedication, along with his many successes, he is widely regarded as one of the most capable and committed rulers in Chinese history. During the 18th century, commerce and the arts continued to flourish under Kangxi's successors, Yongzheng, who ruled from 1722 to 1735, and Qianlong, who ruled from 1735 to 1796. Their prosperity, however, would not continue into the 19th century. Dramatic music. The 19th century was truly an age of exploration and commerce for Western merchants and travelers. Financially weakened by colonial failures in the Americas, Great Britain searched for new opportunities for wealth and resource extraction. This led to a growing interest in China, which was famous for goods such as silk, tea, and porcelain. The Chinese ruling class, however, was not enthusiastic about the trade relationship Britain desired. Fully aware of the instability that could result from opening the empire to foreign powers, the Qing restricted trade with outsiders and regulated commerce as they saw fit. They feared that dependence on foreign trade would weaken central authority and make the Chinese people economically reliant on Western rulers. They also worried that Chinese culture would be sacrificed for Western profits. For this reason, the Qing had already established the Canton system, a series of regulations designed to limit the economic influence of foreign merchants. Foreign traders were only permitted to conduct business through the port of Canton, and the regulations included the following. Foreign trade was restricted to the winter months. Foreign merchants visiting Canton were required to stay in designated districts, known as the foreign factories, and live under the supervision of a guild of Chinese merchants called the Kohong. Chinese citizens were forbidden from borrowing money or accepting employment from foreign traders. Chinese citizens were prohibited from seeking trade or market information from foreigners. Foreign ships arriving in Canton were required to anchor at Whampoa Roads, a designated anchorage downstream from the city where they were inspected by Chinese authorities. European merchants despised these restrictions, believing that they prevented free trade and reduced profits after their long journeys to China. The regulations were considered excessively strict, resulting in a dramatic increase in smuggling and piracy. Even so, European demand for Chinese goods continued to rise. Tea alone accounted for 10% of the British government's revenue, and Britain had no intention of abandoning such a lucrative market. They needed leverage, and they found it in the highly addictive narcotic known as opium. The East India Company, a British trading corporation that had conquered large regions of India, cultivated poppies there to produce opium. The Chinese desired opium for medical, recreational, and social purposes, creating what seemed like the perfect exchange. Tea for drugs. The problem was that the Qing government fully understood the social and health consequences of widespread opium consumption. Opium was illegal in China, as was its importation, large-scale smuggling by foreign powers was especially forbidden. The traders paid little attention to these laws. They established operations along China's borders and smuggled vast quantities of opium into the country. The number of addicts soared, the economy was drained of silver, and China's once powerful trade surplus collapsed. The Daoguang Emperor received numerous proposals to legalize and tax the drug, but he rejected them all. It was clear that immediate action was necessary. In 1839, he appointed the viceroy and political philosopher Lin Zexu to eliminate the opium trade entirely. At first, Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, arguing that she had a moral responsibility to withdraw Britain from the trade. The letter was never read, and Lin was forced to adopt harsher measures. By late January, he had organized coastal defenses and begun arresting thousands of opium users and smugglers. By March, approximately £2.4 million of opium had been confiscated and publicly destroyed as a demonstration of the government's determination to eliminate the drug. British merchants were financially ruined, and tensions between Britain and China continued to escalate. Charles Elliot, Britain's representative in China, failed to ease the conflict, and matters worsened when 2 British sailors murdered a Chinese villager and faced no punishment from either Elliot or the British government. Britain refused to hand the men over to Chinese authorities for execution, infuriating Lin Zexu. The viceroy responded by cutting off food supplies to British merchants, forcing them to retreat to Hong Kong. When British ships returned to Chinese ports to gather supplies, a naval battle erupted between British and Chinese vessels, marking the beginning of the First Opium War. The war continued, with Chinese forces suffering repeated defeats at the hands of Britain's vastly superior navy. In 1840, Lin Zexu was dismissed by the emperor because of his failure to stop the conflict from escalating, and was replaced by the new acting viceroy, Qishan. Qishan was ordered to negotiate peace and reached a tentative agreement with Elliot in 1841. Known as the Convention of Quenpi, the treaty proposed that the Qing Empire would pay Britain £6 million and surrender Hong Kong in exchange for peace. Both Elliot and Qishan were satisfied, but there was one major problem. Qishan had never sought approval from the imperial court and agreed to the terms without consulting his superiors. The emperor was furious and had Qishan arrested, while Elliot's own government dismissed him for accepting what many British officials considered insufficient concessions. Many British soldiers and diplomats wanted the war to continue and refused to settle so easily. As British forces advanced deeper into China, it became increasingly clear that the Qing could no longer resist. Thousands of Chinese soldiers had been killed during the conflict, while British casualties remained below 100. In 1842, the Treaty of Nanjing was signed, establishing several major conditions. The Qing government would pay Britain £20 million. The island of Hong Kong would be ceded to Britain. The Kohong Merchant Guild would be dissolved. 5 Chinese ports would be open to foreign trade. British citizens living in China would be subject to British law rather than Chinese law. This became the first of several agreements that the Chinese would later refer to as the unequal treaties. Agreements that humiliated and exploited the empire. In the aftermath, a major internal threat to the Qing dynasty was brewing. The First Opium War had devastated the economy, while banditry and rebellion were rapidly increasing. One uprising in particular, the Taiping Rebellion, would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, with somewhere between 20 and 30 million people dying in the Civil War. But where exactly did the Taiping Rebellion come from? Years earlier, in 1814, a boy named Hong Xiuquan was born in the Huadu district of Guangzhou. Hong was said to be exceptionally intelligent and dreamed of an academic career from a young age. However, the imperial examinations required to earn positions in academies and prestigious government offices were incredibly difficult and fiercely competitive. Millions of applicants took the tests, and although Hong performed extremely well on the preliminary exam position after his first attempt, he returned to his small village, where he worked as a schoolteacher and saved money. Despite this setback, Hong remained obsessed with his dream of becoming a scholar and government official, repeatedly spending his savings on trips back to Guangzhou to sit for the examinations. After his third failure, however, Hong suffered a severe mental breakdown. His family feared that he would die, as he became completely delirious. During this period, Hong dreamed of heaven and encountered a heavenly family. Hong's heavenly father possessed a long golden beard and wore a black dragon robe, garments traditionally associated with the emperors of China. He complained that the people under his rule worshipped demons instead of him, and presented Hong with a sword to destroy those demons that threatened the heavenly realm. In the dream, Hong and his heavenly brother led a spiritual army that defeated the demons and saved heaven itself. Hong also claimed to have witnessed Confucius being punished by the Heavenly Father for leading the Chinese people astray. The dream remained with Hong, who reportedly became kinder, more open, and more careful in his daily life. After teaching for several more years, Hong once again attempted the imperial examinations and suffered the same fate that had met him the previous 3 times. Following this final failure, one of Hong's cousins suggested that he reread a Christian pamphlet given to him years earlier by a missionary after his second unsuccessful attempt, when he was 22 years old. After reading the material, Hong concluded that Christianity was directly connected to the fever dreams he had experienced during his mental collapse. The Heavenly Father, he believed, must have been God, while the brother who had fought beside him with the spiritual army could only have been Jesus Christ. Hong became convinced that he was literally the Son of God and the younger brother of Jesus. He destroyed all of the Buddhist and Confucian imagery in his home and began passionately preaching Christianity. Eventually, he was banned from teaching in his own village after toppling religious monuments and philosophical idols that he believed contradicted his faith. In 1844, Hong, along with a small group of relatives, former classmates, and followers, left home to preach his religious doctrine across China. As the group steadily expanded, Hong became the leader of a religious movement known as the God-worshipping Society, which attracted thousands of converts. Many peasants were drawn to the society's anti-government message, as Hong believed that the demon-infested Qing dynasty had to be destroyed. Hong created his own interpretation of scripture, known as the authorized Taiping version of the Bible, and claimed that the true religion had existed in ancient times but had been erased by the evil influence of Confucius and the imperial system. By 1850, Hong had gathered tens of thousands of followers, with modern estimates placing the movement's size at as many as 30,000 members. The Qing government grew increasingly alarmed by the rapidly expanding cult and decided to intervene. In Guangxi province, many peasants suffering from famine and economic hardship flocked to Hong's cause, but imperial troops ordered them not to join. Any new converts were to be executed. By January 1851, the God-worshipping society had quickly transformed into a military force and clashed with 7,000 Qing soldiers. Contemporary accounts suggest that the organization of the cult was remarkably sophisticated compared to earlier rebellions, and after a battle that claimed more than 1,000 lives, Hong's forces emerged victorious. Hong then proclaimed the establishment of the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, the state that he hoped would overthrow the Qing dynasty. The movement marched from city to city recruiting followers, growing at an unprecedented rate. In many major settlements, both men and women were willing to die for the cause. In March 1853, one of Hong's armies, consisting of more than 500,000 soldiers, laid siege to the city of Nanjing, which was defended by somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 Qing troops. After 13 days of brutal combat involving bombings, espionage missions, and violent assaults, Hong's forces, known as the Taiping Rebellion, captured the city and declared it their capital. The movement's government was divided among various kings, all of whom claimed that they could communicate directly with God. The most notable of these leaders was Yang Xiuqing, the king of the East. Serving as Hong's right-hand man, Yang introduced reforms that outlawed opium and promoted greater social equality between men and women. The two sexes were separated from one another, with the obvious exception of Hong's own harem. European travelers who visited the new Christian kingdom in southern China, much of which was now under Taiping control, were astonished by the strictness of its laws. Sex, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, prostitution, and dancing were all prohibited, and violating these rules carried the death penalty. Despite the hostility that existed between the Qing dynasty and Western powers after the Opium Wars, Europe did not support the Taiping Rebellion. Hong had appealed to Western nations for assistance, believing that their shared religion would unite them. The United States initially viewed Hong and his rebellion favorably and even considered recognizing Taiping independence from the Qing. Nothing came of these plans, however. Britain, France, and eventually the United States sided with the Qing government for a number of reasons, and came to view the Taiping not as fellow Christians, but as a dangerous and hostile movement. The British wanted the payments guaranteed by the treaties signed after the Opium Wars, payments that a peasant rebellion was unlikely to honour. Furthermore, Hong's claims of being directly related to God and Jesus were viewed as blasphemous by many Europeans, while the enormous violence accompanying the Taiping's advance caused widespread distrust. One particularly horrifying example of this brutality occurred in 1856 during an event known as the Tianjin Incident. Yang Xiuqing overstepped his political authority when he began claiming that he alone was the true vessel of God's word. He had gained enormous influence in his own right and sought to seize power over the kingdom, gathering thousands of followers in the process. Yang repeatedly pretended to be possessed by the Heavenly Father and openly accused Hong of being an impostor. Viewing such claims as treason, Hong responded ruthlessly. He dispatched the King of the West along with several generals to exterminate Yang, his followers, and his relatives. They stormed Yang's palace and killed him before slaughtering his family. They then turned their attention to his supporters. Many followers were lured into the palace under false pretenses and systematically executed. Over the course of 3 months, Hong's forces killed 27,000 civilians in these mass purges. Under Hong's increasingly tyrannical rule, the cult was becoming ever more dangerous, and reports of indiscriminate massacres followed nearly every new conquest. The Qing dynasty, however, could not devote all of its attention to the Taiping. The empire was also facing renewed pressure from Western Europe. A second Opium War was about to begin. Calm music. Despite their overwhelming victory in the First Opium War, Western powers such as Britain, France, and the United States remained dissatisfied with what they had gained in China. They wanted opium to be fully legalized and believed that the Treaty of Nanjing and the agreements that followed had not gone far enough. The British were searching for an excuse to expand their trading privileges and invade China once again, and in October 1856, that opportunity arrived. The Chinese crew of a British-registered ship called the Arrow were arrested by officials in Canton on suspicion of piracy. The captain, a British man named Thomas Kennedy, was aboard a nearby vessel and later claimed that he had witnessed Chinese Marines lowering the British flag during the incident. Outraged British diplomats immediately demanded an apology and the release of all 12 arrested crew members. To their surprise, the new viceroy, Ye Mingchen, released only 9 of the 12 sailors, refusing to free the remaining 3. Within a month, British warships began bombarding Canton, firing upon the poorly defended city. In their attempts to retaliate, Chinese forces attacked American vessels, drawing yet another powerful nation into the conflict. Ye Mingchen offered rewards for every British head taken, but the measure accomplished very little. After smashing through the city's weak defences, skirmishes erupted between Western and Chinese troops as the attackers entered Canton. The American consul planted the United States flag above Ye Mingchen's residence as a symbol of Western dominance. When negotiations failed, the British intensified their assault, destroying more than 20 Chinese ships in November alone. Although the United States and Russia had little interest in formally joining Britain against China, France entered the war in late 1857. The French justification, or casus belli, was the execution of the missionary Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been accused of plotting rebellion in a region closed to foreigners. After refusing to pay a bribe to local officials, Chapdelaine was sentenced to death. He was reportedly beaten so severely that many of his teeth were knocked out and his jaw was shattered. His face was left disfigured. He was then confined inside a small iron cage suspended outside the prison gates. His execution came by suffocation as officials gradually removed the wooden supports beneath him, straining his neck until he died. According to contemporary accounts, local children later threw stones at Chapdelaine's severed head until it fell to the ground and was consumed by stray dogs. On January 1st, 1858, combined British and French forces achieved victory after launching a joint assault on Canton and capturing Ye Mingchen. The Western armies suffered only 15 casualties, while somewhere between 200 and 650 Chinese soldiers lost their lives. Ye Mingchen was exiled to India, where he eventually starved himself to death. Utterly humiliated, the Qing government was once again forced to negotiate. An alliance involving Great Britain, France, the United States, and Russia emerged, ensuring that each of these powers benefited from the new agreement known as the Treaty of Tianjin. The treaty established that all four nations had the right to establish embassies in Beijing, a city that had previously been closed to foreigners. Additional Chinese ports would be open to international trade. Foreign ships would receive free access to the Yangtze River. Foreigners would gain the right to travel freely throughout mainland China. China would pay millions of taels of silver to Britain and France. Shortly after agreeing to this disastrous treaty, ministers urged the Xianfeng emperor to resist the Western powers once again. The emperor decided that he would deny the four nations permission to establish permanent embassies in Beijing, but the alliance soon learned of his intentions. Once again, war erupted. 3 major battles were fought at the Taku forts, which guarded the route to Beijing. After a series of victories and defeats, and hundreds of casualties on both sides, the Western forces emerged victorious once more. They advanced on Beijing, and British troops burned the Xianfeng Emperor's summer palace upon reaching the city. The palace reportedly burned for 3 days and 3 nights. By this point, the Qing army had become virtually powerless. The emperor fled the capital, leaving his brother, Prince Gong, behind to negotiate peace with Britain and France. A new treaty was signed in 1860. Along with massive payments to the Western powers and guarantees of religious freedom for Christians, it contained what many Chinese considered the final humiliation: the legalization of opium. The devastating defeats of the 2 Opium Wars marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty. The period would later become known as the Century of Humiliation. The days when China could remain isolated from the Western world were over, and a long period of instability was only beginning. Throughout all of this, Hong and the Taiping Rebellion had not yet been defeated. Even more cities fell during the Second Opium War, while the Qing struggled against vastly superior foreign powers. Around this time, the Qing rulers increasingly relied upon regional warlords and newly formed armies to oppose the expanding Taiping kingdom. Western nations also began to turn against the Taiping, as the movement had started attacking regions that contained important trading ports. The British and Americans supplied the Qing with weapons and military training, allowing a reorganized imperial army to launch a major offensive. The Qing adopted many of the brutal tactics used by the Taiping themselves, burning entire towns to the ground and carrying out mass executions of civilians. Famine and disease spread as both sides destroyed countless farms and settlements. Hundreds of cities were completely annihilated, their populations slaughtered. Agreements that humiliated and exploited the empire. Dramatic music. In the aftermath, a major internal threat to the Qing dynasty was beginning to emerge. The First Opium War had severely damaged the economy, while banditry and rebellion were spreading throughout the empire. One uprising in particular, the Taiping Rebellion, would become one of the bloodiest conflicts in human history, claiming somewhere between 20 and 30 million lives during the Civil War. But where exactly did the Taiping Rebellion come from? Years earlier, in 1814, a boy named Hong Xiuquan was born in the Huadu district, exceptionally intelligent, and dreamed of becoming a scholar from a young age. However, the imperial examinations required to earn places in prestigious academies and high-ranking government positions were notoriously difficult and fiercely competitive. Millions of candidates sat for the tests, and although Hong performed remarkably well in the preliminary examinations, he failed to secure a position after his first attempt. He returned to his small village, where he became a schoolteacher and worked to save money. Despite his disappointment, Hong remained fixated on his dreams of academic and governmental success, repeatedly spending his savings on journeys back to Guangzhou to take the examinations again. After his third failure, however, Hong suffered a mental breakdown. His family feared that he would die, as he became completely delirious. During this period, Hong dreamed of heaven and encountered a heavenly family. Hong's heavenly father possessed a long golden beard and wore a black dragon robe, garments traditionally associated with the emperors of China. He complained that the people under his rule worshipped demons rather than himself, and gave Hong a sword with which to destroy those evil forces threatening the heavenly realm. In his vision, Hong and his heavenly brother led a spiritual army that defeated the demons and saved heaven itself. Hong also claimed that he witnessed Confucius being punished by the Heavenly Father for leading the Chinese people astray. The dream remained with Hong, who reportedly became far more careful, kind, and open afterward. After several more years of teaching, Hong once again attempted the imperial examinations and met the same fate that had greeted him the previous 3 times. Following this final failure, one of Hong's cousins suggested that he reread a Christian pamphlet that had been given to him years earlier by a missionary after his second failed examination, when he was 22 years old. After reading the material, Hong became convinced that Christianity was directly connected to the fever dreams he had experienced during his mental collapse. The Heavenly Father, he believed, must have been God, while the brother who had fought beside him and his spiritual army could only have been Jesus Christ. Hong concluded that he was literally the Son of God and the younger brother of Jesus. He destroyed all of the Buddhist and Confucian imagery in his home and began passionately preaching Christianity. Eventually, he was banned from teaching in his own village after destroying religious monuments and philosophical idols that he believed conflicted with his faith. In 1844, Hong, accompanied by several relatives, classmates, and followers, left home to spread his religious teachings across China. As the group steadily expanded, Hong became the leader of a movement known as the God-worshipping Society, which attracted thousands of converts. Many peasants embraced the society's anti-government rhetoric, as Hong believed that the demon-infested Qing dynasty had to be overthrown. Hong created his own interpretation of scripture, known as the authorized Taiping version of the Bible, and claimed that the true religion had existed in ancient times but had been erased by the evil influence of Confucius and the imperial system. By 1850, Hong commanded tens of thousands of followers, with modern estimates placing the movement's size at as many as 30,000 members. The Qing government grew increasingly fearful of the rapidly expanding cult and decided to intervene. In Guangxi province, many peasants suffering from famine and economic hardship flocked to Hong's movement, but imperial troops ordered them not to join. Any new converts were to be executed. By January 1851, the god-worshipping society had militarized and clashed with 7,000 Qing soldiers. Accounts from the time suggest that the organization of the cult was surprisingly sophisticated compared to earlier rebellions, and after a battle that claimed more than 1,000 lives, Hong's forces emerged victorious. Hong then proclaimed the founding of the Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, the state that he hoped would overthrow the Qing dynasty. The movement marched from city to city, recruiting followers and expanding at an unprecedented rate. Across many major settlements, both men and women were willing to die for the cause. In March 1853, one of Hong's armies, consisting of more than 500,000 soldiers, launched a siege against the city of Nanjing, which was defended by somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 Qing troops. After 13 days of brutal combat involving bombings, espionage missions, and violent assaults, Hong's forces captured the city and declared it their capital. The movement's government was divided among various kings, all of whom claimed that they could communicate directly with God. The most notable of these leaders was Yang Xiuqing, the king of the East. Serving as Hong's right-hand man, Yang introduced reforms that outlawed opium and promoted greater social equality between men and women. The two sexes were separated from one another, with the obvious exception of Hong's own harem. European travelers who visited the new Christian kingdom in southern China, much of which was now under Taiping control, were astonished by the strictness of its laws. Sex, alcohol, gambling, tobacco, prostitution, and dancing were all prohibited, and violating these rules carried the death penalty. Despite the hostility that existed between the Qing dynasty and Western powers after the Opium Wars, Europe did not support the Taiping Rebellion. Hong had appealed to Western nations for assistance, believing that their shared religion would unite them. The United States initially viewed Hong and his rebellion favorably, and even considered recognizing Taiping independence from the Qing. Nothing came of these plans, however. Britain, France, and eventually the United States sided with the Qing government for a number of reasons, and came to view the Taiping not as fellow Christians, but as a dangerous and hostile movement. The British wanted the payments guaranteed by the treaties signed after the Opium Wars, payments that a peasant rebellion was unlikely to honor. Furthermore, Hong's claims of being directly related to God and Jesus were viewed as blasphemous by many Europeans, while the enormous violence accompanying the Taiping's advance caused widespread distrust. One particularly horrifying example of this brutality occurred in 1856 during an event known as the Tianjin Incident. Yang Xiuqing overstepped his political authority when he began claiming that he alone was the true vessel of God's word. He had gained enormous influence in his own right and sought to seize power over the kingdom, gathering thousands of followers in the process. Yang repeatedly pretended to be possessed by the Heavenly Father and openly accused Hong of being an impostor. Viewing such claims as treason, Hong responded ruthlessly. He dispatched the King of the West along with several generals to exterminate Yang, his followers, and his relatives. They stormed Yang's palace and killed him before slaughtering his family. They then turned their attention to his supporters. Many followers were lured into the palace under false pretenses and systematically executed. Over the course of 3 months, Hong's forces killed 27,000 civilians in these mass purges. Under Hong's increasingly tyrannical rule, the cult was becoming ever more dangerous, and reports of indiscriminate massacres followed nearly every new conquest. The Qing dynasty, however, could not devote all of its attention to the Taiping. The empire was also facing renewed pressure from Western Europe. A second Opium War was about to begin. Calm music. Despite their overwhelming victory in the First Opium War, Western powers such as Britain, France, and the United States remained dissatisfied with what they had gained in China. They wanted opium to be fully legalized and believed that the Treaty of Nanjing and the agreements that followed had not gone far enough. The British were searching for an excuse to expand their trading privileges and invade China once again, and in October 1856, that opportunity arrived. The Chinese crew of a British-registered ship called the Arrow were arrested by officials in Canton on suspicion of piracy. The captain, a British man named Thomas Kennedy, was aboard a nearby vessel and later claimed that he had witnessed Chinese Marines lowering the British flag during the incident. Outraged British diplomats immediately demanded an apology and the release of all 12 arrested crew members. To their surprise, the new viceroy, Ming released only 9 of the 12 sailors, refusing to free the remaining 3. Within a month, British warships began bombarding Canton, firing upon the poorly defended city. In their attempts to retaliate, Chinese forces attacked American vessels, drawing yet another powerful nation into the conflict. Ming offered rewards for every British head taken, but the measure accomplished very little. After smashing through the city's weak defenses, skirmishes erupted between Western and Chinese troops as the attackers entered Canton. The American consul planted the United States flag above Ming's residence as a symbol of Western dominance. When negotiations failed, the British intensified their assault, destroying more than 20 Chinese ships in November alone. Although the United States and Russia had little interest in formally joining Britain against China, France entered the war in late 1857. The French justification, or casus belli, was the execution of the missionary Auguste Chapdelaine, who had been accused of plotting rebellion in a region closed to foreigners. After refusing to pay a bribe to local officials, Chapdelaine was sentenced to death. He was reportedly beaten so severely that many of his teeth were knocked out and his jaw shattered. His face was left disfigured. He was then confined inside a small iron cage suspended outside the prison gates. His execution came by suffocation as officials gradually removed the supports beneath him, slowly tightening the strain on his neck until he died. According to contemporary accounts, local children later threw stones at Chapdelaine's severed head until it fell to the ground and was consumed by stray dogs. On January 1st, 1858, combined British and French forces captured Canton and took Ming prisoner. The Western armies suffered only 15 casualties, while between 200 and 650 Chinese soldiers lost their lives. Ming was exiled to India, where he eventually starved himself to death. Utterly humiliated, the Qing government was once again forced to negotiate. An alliance between Great Britain, France, the United States and Russia emerged, ensuring that each of these powers benefited from the new agreement known as the Treaty of Tianjin. The treaty established that all 4 nations had the right to establish embassies in Beijing, which had previously been closed to foreigners. Additional Chinese ports would be opened to international trade. Foreign ships would receive free access to the Yangtze River. Foreigners would gain the right to travel freely throughout mainland China. China would pay millions of taels of silver to Britain and France. Shortly after agreeing to this disastrous treaty, ministers urged the Xianfeng Emperor to resist the Western powers once again. The emperor decided that he would deny the 4 nations permission to establish permanent embassies in Beijing, but the alliance soon learned of his intentions. Once again, war erupted. 3 major battles were fought at the Taku forts, which guarded the route to Beijing. After a series of victories and defeats and hundreds of casualties on both sides, the Western forces emerged victorious once more. They advanced on Beijing, and British troops burned the Xianfeng Emperor's summer palace upon reaching the city. The palace reportedly burned for 3 days and 3 nights. By this point, the Qing army had become virtually powerless. The emperor fled the capital, leaving his brother, Prince Gong, behind to negotiate peace with Britain and France. A new treaty was signed in 1860. Along with massive payments to the Western powers and guarantees of religious freedom for Christians, it contained what many Chinese considered the final humiliation: the legalization of opium. The devastating defeats of the Opium Wars marked the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty. The period would later become known as the Century of Humiliation. The days when China could remain isolated from the Western world were over, and a long era of instability was only beginning. Throughout all of this, Hong and the Taiping Rebellion had not yet been defeated. More cities fell during the Second Opium War, while the Qing struggled against vastly superior foreign powers. Around this time, the Qing rulers increasingly relied upon regional warlords and newly formed armies to oppose the expanding Taiping kingdom. Western nations also began to turn against the Taiping, as the movement had started attacking regions containing important foreign trading ports. The British and Americans supplied the Qing with weapons and military training, allowing a reorganized imperial army to launch a major offensive. The Qing adopted many of the brutal tactics used by the Taiping themselves, burning entire towns to the ground and carrying out mass executions of civilians. Famine and disease spread as both sides destroyed countless farms and settlements. Hundreds of cities were completely annihilated, their populations slaughtered. Some citizens trapped within Taiping territory, and besieged cities resorted to cannibalism and even sold human flesh because the famine had become so severe. The Taiping were gradually pushed farther and farther back, losing much of their territory in southern China until only their capital, Nanjing, remained. The Qing army completely surrounded the Taiping kingdom, and starvation began to spread within the city walls as imperial forces severed the supply routes. It was simply a matter of time before the rebellion was crushed. Hong's officials urged him to abandon the city, regroup, and formulate a new strategy against the resurgent Qing forces. Hong, however, truly believed that the Taiping had God on their side, and that they could never be defeated as long as they remained his chosen people. As conditions in the city continued to worsen, repeated arguments with his increasingly desperate advisors finally convinced Hong to leave the palace. Addressing his followers, Hong declared that they would survive on manna sent down from heaven. In the Bible, manna was the miraculous food that God provided to the Israelites during their journey through the desert, and Hong believed that the same divine gift would sustain him and his followers. The starving inhabitants began eating wild weeds, believing them to be manna. Instead, Hong died of food poisoning in June 1864. The Qing army finally entered Nanjing and killed the remaining Taiping leaders. They were not finished there. Many of Hong's followers were executed in house-to-house massacres carried out by Qing soldiers, while thousands of others resorted to mass suicide by setting themselves on fire. On July the 30th of that same year, Qing troops located Hong Xiuquan's body and removed it from its grave. Determined to punish the rebel leader even in death and ensure that he would never have a final resting place, they cut off his head and cremated his remains. Hong's ashes were then fired from a cannon so that they would be scattered without any trace of order or ceremony. After tens of millions of deaths, most caused by famine and disease, the war had been decisively won by the Qing dynasty, and the imperial court once again believed that it could maintain its hold over China. That belief, however, proved to be dangerously misguided. Corruption ran rampant in the turbulent years following the Opium Wars, and the Qing dynasty lacked strong central leadership. To the east, Japan was rapidly modernizing and adapting to Western influence far more successfully than the Qing Empire. Under Emperor Meiji, Japan expanded its territory and strengthened its military, eventually turning its attention toward Korea, despite the peninsula having remained under Chinese influence for centuries. In 1875, Korea was forced to sign a treaty opening its ports to foreign powers, with a heavy emphasis on trade with Japan. This effectively weakened China's influence in the region, as Korea was compelled to declare that its foreign relations were independent of Qing authority. Both China and Japan stationed troops in Korea, although a series of treaties temporarily prevented direct conflict and eventually led to both sides withdrawing their forces. The peace, however, did not last. Tensions continued to rise over the following 2 decades as troops maneuvered across the peninsula, until the two empires finally reached a breaking point in 1894. A series of coups and assassinations in Korea shattered the agreements that had maintained the peace, and on August 1st, war was officially declared between the Qing Empire and the Empire of Japan. Although China possessed roughly 4 times as many troops as Japan, its forces were poorly prepared. Once again, Japan had modernized far more successfully, and its soldiers proved significantly more capable. By this point, China had acquired modern military equipment, but its troops remained disorganized and inadequately trained. The Japanese repeatedly pushed the Qing forces back in a series of devastating defeats. Neither the Chinese navy nor its infantry could match the strength of the Japanese military. By the spring of 1895, Japan had successfully invaded both Manchuria and the province of Shandong. China was defeated, and the Treaty of Shimonoseki was signed on April 17th. The treaty required China to cede Taiwan, recognize the independence of Korea, and pay an enormous indemnity to Japan. Just like that, the Qing dynasty had suffered yet another crushing defeat, adding another chapter to the century of humiliation. Gentle music. In the aftermath of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, the First Sino-Japanese War, and finally the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, a violent anti-foreigner movement organized by a secret society, the Qing dynasty had descended into complete chaos. Other uprisings erupted throughout the empire as countless people lost faith in the Qing government's ability to preserve China's strength in an increasingly industrialized world. In 1910 alone, there were 285 recorded rebellions. Most, however, were led by peasants who lacked a clear vision of what a new China should become. One movement stood apart from the others: the Revolutionary Alliance. Dr. Sun Yat-sen, a physician turned revolutionary, had founded the organization and gathered roughly 10,000 followers by 1911, many of whom were highly educated and had studied abroad. The movement sought to radicalize Qing soldiers and convince them to rise up against the dynasty, and it continued to grow in secret. The Revolutionary Alliance spread its message through fake book clubs and other seemingly harmless organizations, dissolving them whenever authorities began to investigate. Across China, countless soldiers became radicalized and prepared to turn against the Qing. On October 10, 1911, the first uprising began. Members of the new army stationed in Wuchang attacked the viceroy's residence and seized control of the city after he fled. 500 Manchu soldiers were killed, while another 300 were captured. The ammunition depots and mint had fallen into rebel hands, and a military government was quickly established. The revolutionaries, however, still lacked centralized leadership, as Dr. Sun Yat-sen was not even in China at the time. He was traveling in the West, lobbying for American, British, and French support and urging those nations to stop providing financial assistance to the Qing dynasty. After securing the leadership of a high-ranking officer named Li Yuanhong, the revolution continued. 2 more cities were captured, and the possibility that the rebels would seize all of Hubei province became increasingly real. The Qing government needed to respond immediately and called upon the retired statesman Yuan Shikai to suppress the uprising. As Yuan considered whether he should accept the offer, the rebellion continued to spread. Qing officials and their families were massacred, supply lines were disrupted, and the revolutionaries gained more territory. After Yuan Shikai finally accepted, he was appointed Prime Minister on November 1, 1911, and began negotiating with the revolutionaries. Shortly afterward, Sun Yat-sen returned from his diplomatic mission and was elected president of the Provisional Republican Government. The center of Sun's newly proclaimed Republic of China was established in Nanjing, which the revolutionaries had recently captured. The Qing dynasty was all but finished. Its reforms had come too late, and as a result, the imperial family abdicated in early 1912. This transformation was unlike the power struggles between rival families and warlords that had characterized earlier Chinese history. With the Qing dynasty overthrown by the Republic of China, the dynastic cycle that had defined China for thousands of years finally came to an end. China was entering an entirely new era. As part of earlier negotiations, Dr. Sun Yat-sen handed the presidency of the Republic to Yuan Shikai, who had promised to convince the Qing emperor to abdicate. Sun had no objections to the arrangement so long as it ensured the end of the Qing dynasty. Unfortunately, only a few years later, in late 1915, the politically ambitious Yuan Shikai decided that the presidency was not enough. He wanted to become emperor. Yuan declared himself emperor of China, a decision that angered many across the country. The people did not want a return to the old system, and another emperor represented exactly that. His reign collapsed almost immediately, and he was forced to abdicate in March 1916. Before he could fully lose power, however, Yuan died 3 months later, leaving behind an unstable republic without a strong central government. His selfish desire to restore the monarchy had plunged the country into chaos. What followed became known as the Warlord era, which lasted from 1916 until 1928. Because countless regional leaders and military commanders refused to submit to Yuan Shikai's authority, China became deeply fragmented. A glance at a map of the divided armies reveals the scale of the political disaster that had been created by the Republic's first president. The future seemed uncertain, although some men still held on to hope. One of them was the revolutionary Sun Yat-sen. He established a new government in southern China with the goal of reunifying the country under the Republic of China. His movement, now called the Kuomintang, or KMT, sought to restore centralized authority. Another major political force was also emerging during this period. The May 4th movement, an intellectual, patriotic, and revolutionary movement that lasted from 1917 to 1921, encouraged the spread of Marxist ideas and led to the creation of the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. Although the two parties formed an alliance in 1922, united in their desire to end the regional divisions tearing China apart, they would soon become enemies in the bloody Chinese Civil War. After Sun Yat-sen's untimely death from cancer in 1925, a power vacuum emerged within the movement. A fierce struggle for leadership followed, ultimately resulting in the rise of General Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang sought to reunify the fractured territories of the warlord era and consolidate power under the Republic. He also viewed the growing Communist Party as a threat, believing that its connections to peasant revolts endangered the future of the government. After the Kuomintang successfully defeated many of the warlords and reclaimed major cities across China, the CCP no longer served an immediate purpose in Chiang's eyes. Instead, it stood in the way of his vision for a unified China. After uncovering a plot against him, Chiang launched a violent crackdown on communist organizers. The most famous example was the Shanghai Massacre, during which thousands of communists, leftists, and members of the Shanghai labor militias were purged in the name of securing China's future. As the struggling CCP attempted to decide its next course of action, leaders Li Lisan and Mao Zedong disagreed over the future of communism in China. Li advocated remaining in the major cities and rejected the idea of retreat. Mao, on the other hand, believed that China's rural peasantry represented the true heart of the revolution and argued that the communists should regroup in the countryside. Mao's strategy prevailed. Over the following years, he rebuilt his movement in remote regions of China, where the far more powerful Kuomintang lacked complete control. This struggle was not merely a Chinese affair. The Soviet Union supported both Li and Mao, hoping to expand a global network of communist states. During the 1930s, Imperial Japan also began expanding into mainland China. The invasion of Manchuria marked a new age of Japanese imperialism and steadily escalated toward full-scale war. That war had not yet officially begun, however, and the invasion forced the Kuomintang to divide its attention between the civil war against the CCP and the growing threat posed by Japan. The nationalists launched their fourth encirclement campaign against the communists in 1932, hoping to eliminate the remaining members of the CCP. The Red Army, however, managed to retreat strategically and avoid destruction after the opening battles. Meanwhile, Japan continued advancing through northeastern China, stretching Kuomintang manpower and resources thin and allowing communist guerrillas to regain strength. Mao was not ashamed of his many tactical withdrawals. On the contrary, he took pride in the Red Army's guerrilla warfare, arguing that hit-and-run tactics were necessary in the struggle between the oppressed and the oppressor. He understood that the communists were weaker in conventional military terms and needed to rely on surprise attacks and popular support. Mao emphasized maintaining the goodwill of ordinary civilians, believing that their support was essential for any successful revolution. In 1934, after signing agreements with Japan that allowed them to focus on the communists, the nationalists accepted the assistance of the German general Hans von Seeckt. Although relations between China and Germany were strained by racial prejudice, Hans implemented a strategy of encirclement and scorched earth warfare against the communists. His plan involved destroying crops and resources that could support the enemy, forcing the weakened CCP into open battle, where it could no longer rely on ambushes and guerrilla tactics. The strategy proved effective. The communists suffered a series of major defeats at the hands of the strengthened nationalists who had assembled their largest army yet. These setbacks triggered a massive retreat known as the Long March. Covering roughly 10,000 kilometers over 13 months, the communists sought to relocate their base from southeastern China to the northwest. 90,000 soldiers and 20,000 civilians began the journey in September 1934, enduring 15 major battles, constant skirmishes, starvation, disease, and brutal weather. It was an incredibly harsh ordeal, with 90% of Mao's forces dying before the march came to an end. The suffering did not break Mao's determination. In October 1935, Mao and the surviving 10% of his followers arrived in Shaanxi province and united with communist forces already stationed there. More peasants from neighboring regions were recruited as the CCP treated them favorably and prepared to continue the struggle against the Kuomintang. In 1937, however, hostilities between the two sides temporarily ceased. Japan had become an even greater threat to China's future, forcing the Kuomintang and the communists to establish a second united front against their common enemy. Chiang Kai-shek was reluctant to accept this alliance, but his hand was forced after he was kidnapped by his own generals, who believed that Japan posed a far greater danger than the communists. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in July 1937 and would continue until the end of the Second World War, in September 1945. It would witness some of the most horrifying battles and massacres not only in Chinese history, but in the history of the entire world. The Japanese already held a major advantage over the Chinese because of the favorable terms established in their previous ceasefire agreement. They controlled regions of China that the KMT were forbidden from militarizing and already had troops stationed within Chinese borders. After capturing Beijing and Shanghai by November 1937, the Japanese turned their attention toward the KMT capital of Nanjing. This would result in the deaths of more than 200,000 Chinese civilians in a massacre that became known as the Rape of Nanjing. In December of that same year, Japanese troops began marching toward the capital city. By that point, Chiang Kai-shek had already withdrawn all official army units from Nanjing, unwilling to risk the loss of a large number of soldiers. This left the city almost defenseless against the Imperial Japanese Army, protected only by largely untrained auxiliary troops who had previously served as support personnel for the KMT. During the Japanese advance, the Nanjing Safety Zone was established in the center of the city. Many Westerners, including missionaries and businessmen, were living in Nanjing at the time and organized a series of demilitarized refugee camps for those citizens who had been unable to flee. That decision ultimately saved the lives of roughly 250,000 people. On December 13th, the Japanese arrived and encountered very little military resistance. They immediately began executing Chinese prisoners of war and digging mass graves. Homes were looted, buildings were burned to the ground, and soldiers separated terrified families. Some Japanese troops even engaged in killing contests, competing to see who could execute 100 victims first, using only a sword. Prisoners were used as target practice. Young children were killed while their mothers were brutally assaulted and murdered. Unarmed boys were beheaded in indiscriminate killings, and young girls were dragged into the streets to suffer abuse. The Nanjing Massacre remains one of the worst atrocities in human history and an eternal stain on the history of East Asia. It is estimated that more than 200,000 civilians were killed, while between 20,000 and 80,000 women were sexually assaulted. After the destruction of Nanjing, Wuhan became the de facto capital of China, and later served as the site of the aptly named Battle of Wuhan, which lasted for 4 months in 1938. Hundreds of thousands died, as both sides suffered unimaginably heavy losses. Although the battle ended in another Japanese victory, the enormous casualties weakened the imperial army, which was also beginning to struggle financially. When Japanese forces later pushed into communist territory, they were forced to retreat by guerrilla fighters. The tide of war was beginning to shift, with the allied Chinese forces slowing the advance of the Imperial Japanese Army until a kind of stalemate emerged and large-scale battles became less common. Guerrilla warfare proved highly effective and allowed the Chinese military to survive in the face of the invasion. They held out until the end of the Second World War and witnessed Japan's crushing defeat at the hands of the Allied powers, particularly after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki by the United States. In September 1945, Japan formally surrendered in China. With the war over, China was recognized as one of the Big Four Allied powers alongside the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States, and regained all of the territory that Japan had occupied. The end of the Second World War did not bring peace to China, however. The Chinese Civil War resumed, and a struggle for resources and major cities broke out once more between the KMT and the CCP. The United States attempted to mediate the conflict, but its efforts failed. The renewed civil war lasted from 1945 to 1949 and ended with Mao Zedong and his hardened Red Army taking control of China once and for all. Having secured far greater support than the KMT in rural areas, Mao was able to capture the resource-rich centers of the country using the People's Liberation Army, the military wing of the Chinese Communist Party. It was a decisive victory, with the balance of power between the two armies almost completely reversed from what it had been during the earlier years of the conflict. The People's Republic of China was established by the CCP on October 1st. 1949. The 55-year-old Mao Zedong, now leading the nation, was initially viewed very favorably by much of the Chinese population, as he had reunified China and appeared to be a champion of ordinary people. In his first years in power, Mao reduced class inequality through sweeping reforms that redistributed land among the peasantry. More than 1 million landlords were executed during this period, which became known as the Land Reform Movement. Mao hoped to destroy the remaining elements of feudalism and capitalism within Chinese society. He also sought to modernize and industrialize the country and attempted to do so through the social and economic campaign of 1958, known as the Great Leap Forward, which would ultimately result in the executions and famine-related deaths of somewhere between 30 and 45 million Chinese citizens. The reforms focused heavily on collectivization, and communal farming was introduced, with private property effectively abolished. Government control over agriculture allowed grain to be acquired cheaply. During this time, backyard furnaces were established in every commune to encourage steel production. Very few people understood how to operate them properly, yet citizens were forced to throw their possessions into the furnaces in an effort to increase production, while larger factories also began to appear. Many people were pulled away from their schools and original professions to work in these industries, but the project proved to be a disaster. Steel production became an immense failure, producing low-quality and often unusable materials while diverting valuable manpower and resources away from essential sectors, such as food production. By 1959, the Great Chinese Famine had begun as a result of these failed policies, compounded by natural disasters that devastated grain reserves across the communes. Reports of people eating household pets and even resorting to cannibalism became increasingly common. The famine caused by the Great Leap Forward killed tens of millions of Chinese citizens and forced Mao to resign as state chairman. He was succeeded by Liu Shaoqi. Mao, however, had not truly surrendered his power in any meaningful sense. His withdrawal was only temporary. In July 1966, Mao took a symbolic swim in the Yangtze River to demonstrate his strength and vitality after rumors spread that old age had weakened him. He reclaimed his position as chairman and launched his second major campaign of reforms, the Cultural Revolution. The movement sought to eliminate all remaining traces of capitalist thought in Chinese society and secure Maoist dominance over the country. To accomplish this, Mao initiated a radical campaign against those he viewed as bourgeois infiltrators undermining China. He mobilized a youth organization known as the Red Guards, encouraging its members to crush any anti-Maoist sentiment. The Red Guards revered Mao almost like a deity and carried out whatever tasks he demanded. Their fanaticism helped spark Red August, a series of massacres that claimed roughly 10,000 lives. 27 educators were murdered by their own students for opposing Mao's policies, while countless intellectuals and elderly citizens were tortured. Police were forbidden from intervening in the violence. As Mao continued to encourage the persecution of his opponents, temples, historical sites, and ancient texts were destroyed by Red Guards in the name of creating a new China. The nation eventually descended into chaos as the revolutionaries split into rival factions, prompting Mao to restore order with the official military in 1968. He turned against the Red Guards once they had served their purpose and exiled many of them to the countryside, where they would pose less of a threat. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people had died. When Mao died in 1976, historians estimated that between 40 and 80 million deaths from famine, overwork, and political violence could be linked to his rule. Mao was succeeded by Deng Xiaoping, who openly criticized many of Mao's policies in later years and steered China toward a somewhat more open, market-driven economy. Under Deng, China's trade and economy expanded dramatically, and the country's GDP increased many times over. Even so, turbulent years still lay ahead. In the spring of 1989, university students across China began calling for major political and economic reforms. There was a growing belief that communism was declining, and tensions reached a boiling point when Hu Yaobang, the former chairman and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, died on April 15, 1989, at the age of 73. Hu was widely admired by the public and seen as a symbol of hope in a political system increasingly associated with corruption and nepotism. An enemy of many party elders, he had supported more liberal economic policies and fewer restrictions on free speech. Following his death, Hu became an important symbol of liberalization for many students. His funeral began on April 22nd, and public gatherings were organized in cities across China to honor him. These gatherings gradually transformed into demonstrations against the country's lack of democratic reforms. The largest protest took place in Tiananmen Square in the center of Beijing, and it continued to grow as clashes with police encouraged more students to join. The protesters sought dialogue with the government and drafted 7 demands for the ruling party. Their demands were as follows: affirm Hu Yaobang's views on democracy and freedom as correct. Admit that the campaigns against spiritual pollution and bourgeois liberalization had been mistaken. Publish information regarding the income of state leaders and their families. Permit privately owned newspapers and end press censorship. Increase funding for education and raise the salaries of intellectuals. End restrictions on demonstrations in Beijing. Provide objective media coverage of the students. When the protesters attempted to present their demands to Communist Party officials, police once again shut them down. Nevertheless, the movement continued to grow. Strikes spread through universities, and the government adopted a harsher stance toward the demonstrations. Fearing disorder, officials accused the students of plotting civil unrest, which only intensified tensions. More than 100,000 students and workers gathered in Tiananmen Square demanding that the government withdraw its accusations. Many participants began hunger strikes, attracting even more support. Government speeches delivered in the square failed to calm the crowds. The protesters refused to leave. The students have certain requirements which must be met, otherwise they won't leave the square. After numerous internal debates and political struggles over how to respond, many government officials were dismissed. During the final weeks of May, martial law was declared and the military was ordered into Beijing, but the troops were blocked by enormous crowds of citizens filling the streets. Art students among the demonstrators built a massive papier-mâché statue known as the Goddess of Democracy, which became a symbol of resistance against the Communist Party. Many Western journalists were present in the square, broadcasting events to the rest of the world. Like the government itself, however, the protesters were becoming increasingly disorganized. The square was overcrowded, and the movement lacked centralized leadership. Students split into rival factions and accused one another of hidden motives, such as seeking fame or secretly collaborating with the government. It was a perfect storm of chaos. Then, everything erupted. By early June, the government had reached its breaking point, and on June 3rd, the People's Liberation Army was ordered into Beijing. Emergency broadcasts demanded that citizens stay away from Tiananmen Square, but many ignored the warnings. Some protesters issued their own broadcasts, calling on residents to arm themselves and defend the demonstrations. As troops entered the city, protesters set buses on fire in an attempt to block the military's advance, prompting soldiers to open fire. Many people were killed, while others were beaten in the streets. Some soldiers were attacked by protesters wielding rocks and Molotov cocktails and were beaten to death after being dragged from their vehicles. Tanks rolled forward, crushing obstacles in their path. Because of government censorship surrounding the Tiananmen Square crackdown, the exact number of deaths remains unknown. Journalists were prevented from reporting freely, leaving relatively little footage behind. Although there is no official death toll, estimates range from several hundred to as many as 10,000 people. By the morning of June 5th, troops had secured Tiananmen Square and cleared the remaining protesters. One figure, however, continued to resist. An unknown man, later called Tank Man, stood alone in front of a line of tanks. The American photographer Jeff Widener captured images of the solitary, unarmed protester confronting the military vehicles. The photograph earned Widener a Pulitzer Prize nomination and has since become a global symbol of resistance in the face of oppression and tyranny. After the square was brought under government control, state employees and journalists who expressed sympathy toward the protesters lost their jobs, while some were placed under house arrest. A number of demonstrators were later executed, while others received lengthy prison sentences. The United States, sympathizing with the pro-democracy protesters, imposed diplomatic and economic sanctions on China, and Western opinion of the country deteriorated significantly. China's economy suffered from the sudden reduction in trade. Meanwhile, enormous changes were taking place across the communist world. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, leaving China as the only major communist power on Earth. Despite its growing isolation and the economic damage caused by the Tiananmen incident, China recovered financially throughout the 1990s as sanctions were gradually lifted and a mixed economy combining socialism and capitalism emerged. Isolationist policies were reversed, and the newly opened country continued to operate under Deng Xiaoping's famous motto, "To get rich is glorious." We are now approaching the modern era, which brings us to the most important figure in contemporary China, Xi Jinping. But who exactly is Xi Jinping, and where did he come from? On June 15, 1953, Xi Jinping was born in Beijing. His father, Xi Zhongxun, was a former member of the Red Army who had fought alongside Mao Zedong during the Chinese Civil War. He later served as a high-ranking Communist Party official and, although he eventually fell out of favor after criticizing the government's response to the Tiananmen Square protests, remained politically active until his retirement in 1993. Xi Jinping's mother, Qi Xin, was also a committed communist who worked as a consultant in state-run schools. After graduating from Tsinghua University's chemical engineering program in Beijing, Xi Jinping's political career began in 1972. He initially served as a secretary for Geng Biao, a senior government official and former subordinate of his father. After 3 years under Geng, Xi became deputy secretary of the Communist Party in Hebei province, a position involving party organization and policy implementation. He performed exceptionally well and steadily climbed the political ladder throughout the 1980s and 1990s, marrying the famous folk singer Peng Liyuan along the way. By 1999, Xi had become the acting governor of Fujian province, granting him greater administrative authority and influence over infrastructure projects. His rise did not slow after that achievement. 8 years later, a major social security corruption scandal created new opportunities within the government. Having successfully avoided controversy himself, Xi seized the moment. In October 2007, he was appointed to the 9-member Politburo Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, the country's highest governing body. When Xi was ranked above Li Keqiang, another rising politician and contender to succeed President Hu Jintao, it became increasingly clear that he was destined to become China's next leader. He was elected vice president in the spring of 2008 and oversaw major projects, including the Beijing Summer Olympics later that year. He also became a central figure in managing relations with Hong Kong. In later years, Xi entered into a political rivalry with Bo Xilai, another prominent contender, but a major scandal paved the way for Xi's rise. The Wang Lijun incident began in 2011 when Neil Haywood, a British businessman, was found dead in a hotel room in Chongqing. Haywood had worked with Bo Xilai and Bo's wife, Gu Kailai, for more than a decade. Initially, authorities ruled his death an accident caused by excessive alcohol consumption. Only months later, however, Police Chief Wang Lijun sought refuge at the United States consulate and claimed that Gu Kailai had poisoned Haywood. A murder investigation followed, eventually confirming that Gu had ordered the killing during a mental breakdown brought on by blackmail and financial disputes involving a failed real estate venture. Gu received a suspended death sentence, which was later commuted to life imprisonment. Bo Xilai's political career was destroyed, and he was removed from the Communist Party. The scandal cleared the path for Xi Jinping's uncontested rise to power. On March 14, 2013, Xi was elected president by the National People's Congress and quickly introduced a series of measures designed to strengthen the Communist Party's authority. Anti-corruption campaigns were launched, political power became increasingly centralized, and efforts to tighten ideological control intensified. Internet and media censorship expanded to limit content considered hostile to the Communist Party, while surveillance increased significantly. China now possesses hundreds of millions of surveillance cameras, amounting to roughly one camera for every 2 citizens. The social credit system was also introduced as a means of monitoring society. The system evaluates citizens according to various factors, including financial behavior, criminal records, and other measures believed to reflect alignment with government expectations. By 2018, presidential term limits had been abolished entirely. Xi was later awarded a third 5-year term, and with such concentrated power, many observers believe he could remain in office indefinitely. Under Xi Jinping's firm leadership, China has maintained its status as an economic superpower. The country continues to industrialize at a rapid pace and remains a global leader in manufacturing. Its population has grown to roughly 1.4 billion people, surpassed only slightly by India in 2023. And China's international influence continues to expand. Tensions have risen over the possibility of military action against Taiwan and Beijing's tightening control over Hong Kong. Many African nations in which China has invested heavily have also experienced increased Chinese influence, a process that some critics describe as a form of neo-colonialism. Many in the West worry about the diplomatic and global consequences of China's growing ambitions. The Chinese military has developed into the world's second most powerful armed force, behind only the United States, and now possesses the largest navy on Earth. Mandarin Chinese, spoken by nearly 1 billion people worldwide, is often described as the language of the future as China continues to cement its place in the age of globalization. Yet no one truly knows which nation will dominate tomorrow or what the future holds. Only one thing is certain about this remarkable land: the stories that make up the rich history of Earth's longest continuous civilization, China, will continue to be told for generations to come.